close your eyes and let yourself drift. Let the world around you soften and blur. Let the hum of the day fade into something quieter, something still, because tonight we're going somewhere strange, somewhere unsettling, somewhere that will make you think about the fragile architecture of belief itself, about the thin membrane that separates conviction from delusion, faith from catastrophe. And we begin not with an idea, but with a place, a real place, a sprawling 9,000 square foot mansion nestled in the rolling sun-bleached hills of Rancho Santa Fe, California, one of the wealthiest communities in the United States, a place of manicured lawns and imported Italian cypress trees and terracotta rooftops glowing amber in the late afternoon light, a place where the Pacific breeze carries the scent of sage and ocean salt through winding streets named after Spanish saints. And on the morning of March 26, 1997, 2 deputies from the San Diego County Sheriff's Department arrived at 18,241 Colina Norte, a rented estate sitting at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac behind a gate of wrought iron and climbing bougainvillea, because an anonymous tip had come in. A former member of a group that lived there, a man named Rio D'Angelo, had received a package in the mail, a package containing 2 videotapes, and on those tapes were people he recognized, people he had once lived with, people he had eaten meals with and meditated with and shared years of his life with, and they were smiling calmly into the camera and saying goodbye, saying they were leaving, saying they were going home. And the word home did not mean what you think it means. It did not mean a house or a city or a country. It meant something so far beyond the ordinary understanding of that word that when D'Angelo watched those tapes, he felt the blood drain from his face, and he picked up the phone and called the authorities, because he knew what those tapes meant. He knew what these people were about to do, or had already done, and when the deputies pushed open the heavy wooden front door of that mansion, the smell hit them first, that unmistakable sweet and suffocating rot that rises from decomposing flesh, the smell that every officer learns to recognize on their first encounter with death and never, ever forgets. A smell that lodges itself not just in the nostrils but in the memory, in the very cells of the brain, and they pulled their shirts over their faces and moved through the tiled foyer into the main living areas, and what they found there would become one of the most haunting crime scenes in American history, not because of violence, not because of blood or struggle or chaos, but because of the opposite, because of the absolute, meticulous, almost surgical calm of it all, because of the eerie, suffocating orderliness that pervaded every room, every surface, every detail. Because lying on bunk beds and cots and mattresses arranged neatly throughout the rooms of that mansion were 39 human beings, all of them dead, all of them lying on their backs with their arms straight at their sides, their hands resting gently on their thighs or folded across their abdomens, all of them dressed identically in black shirts buttoned to the collar and pressed black pants, all of them wearing brand new black Nike Decade sneakers, the same model, the same style, each pair sized perfectly to its wearer's feet, as if they had been measured and fitted and purchased with extraordinary care, and over each face lay a square purple shroud, a piece of fine purple fabric cut to precisely the same dimensions and placed with such geometric precision that it looked ritualistic, liturgical, sacramental, like the altar cloths of some alien religion that worshipped not a god you would recognize, but something stranger, something colder, something that lived among the stars. And beside each body sat a packed overnight bag, a small travel bag with neatly folded clothing inside, a change of clothes, toiletries, as though each person had prepared for a trip, a journey, a departure to somewhere that required luggage. And in each of their pockets was a $5 bill and 3/4, exactly $5.75, the same amount, person after person, as if this sum held some significance known only to them, some cosmic fare for a passage that existed only in their shared imagination. And the deputies moved from room to room finding more of them, always the same, always the black clothes and the purple shrouds and the packed bags and the sneakers, bodies arranged in concentric patterns on their beds, and the faces beneath those shrouds were peaceful, relaxed, some of them almost smiling. The muscles of the jaw and forehead slack and smooth, the expressions of people who had lain down not in terror but in anticipation, not in despair but in hope, and there was no sign of restraint anywhere in that house, no sign of force, no ropes or chains or locked doors or barred windows, no scratches on the door frames, no fingernail marks on the walls, no evidence that anyone had tried to leave or resist or change their mind at the last moment, Every door was unlocked, every window could have been opened, every person in that house could have stood up and walked out into the California sunshine and driven away and gone back to their life at any point during the 3 days it took for all 39 of them to die. And not one of them did. Not one. And the toxicology reports would later reveal that each person had consumed a lethal mixture of phenobarbital and vodka, the barbiturate carefully measured and stirred into applesauce or pudding to mask its bitter taste. And then after eating, they had placed plastic bags over their heads and secured them with rubber bands to accelerate the asphyxiation that the drug would eventually cause on its own. And they had done this in shifts, in waves, in carefully organised groups of approximately 15, then the final 9, each group cleaning up after the previous one, removing the plastic bags from the faces of the already dead, replacing them with the purple shrouds, tucking in the arms, straightening the clothing, smoothing the creases from the shirts, making everything neat, everything orderly, everything perfect, tending to the dead with the gentle precision of morticians or of children putting their dolls to bed, before lying down themselves on their own bunks and eating their own portion of the phenobarbital-laced pudding, and pulling their own plastic bags over their own heads, and closing their eyes, and drifting away into whatever waited for them on the other side. And the last 2 to die, the final pair, had no one left to tidy them, no one to remove their plastic bags and replace them with the purple cloth, and even they were found composed, arranged, deliberate, their bodies positioned with the same care as all the others, and the whole scene looked less like a mass suicide and more like a dormitory at lights out, a military barracks at taps, a group of weary travellers who had simply lain down to sleep before an early morning flight, and in a sense that is exactly what they believed they were doing, because these 39 people, the members of a group called Heaven's Gate, believed with absolute unshakable diamond-hard certainty that a spacecraft was travelling in the wake of the Hale-Bopp comet, which at that very moment was blazing across the northern hemisphere sky in one of the most spectacular cometary displays of the 20th century, a comet so bright and so enormous that you could see it with the naked eye even from the light-polluted suburbs, hanging in the evening sky like a smudge of white fire, its twin tails of dust and ionized gas streaming behind it for millions of miles, and they believed that this spacecraft had come for them specifically, that it was piloted by beings from what they called the next level, members of an advanced extraterrestrial civilization that existed beyond the physical universe as we understand it, and that by shedding their physical bodies, which they referred to not as bodies, but as vehicles or containers, temporary biological suits worn for the duration of their stay on this planet, their souls would be beamed up, collected, transported to that ship and carried away from Earth forever, graduating from the human condition into something higher, something purer, something luminous and perfected, and beyond the reach of suffering and confusion and death and desire. And so they had not killed themselves, not in their own understanding of the word. They had not committed suicide. They had simply stepped out of their vehicles the way you might step out of a rental car at the airport at the end of a long drive, leaving the keys on the seat, walking away without looking back, and the mansion fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant drone of a gardener's leaf blower somewhere down the street, and the March sunlight poured through the plantation shutters onto the rows of black-clad bodies in their purple shrouds, casting long geometric shadows across the carpet, and outside the mockingbirds sang their borrowed songs in the eucalyptus trees, and the automatic sprinklers hissed and clicked on the lawns of the neighbouring estates, where families were eating breakfast and children were getting ready for school, and the world kept turning, indifferent and vast and utterly unconcerned with what had happened inside that house, and the comet kept moving across the sky on its long elliptical orbit, and there was no spaceship behind it. There had never been a spaceship behind it, and these 39 people were simply dead, their bodies already beginning the slow chemical process of returning to the earth from which they came. And let that image sit with you for a moment. Let it settle into your awareness like sediment drifting to the bottom of a still pond, the purple shrouds and the packed bags and the matching sneakers and the $5.75, because what happened in that mansion is not a story about crazy people. It is not a story about gullible fools or broken minds or people too stupid to know better, and that is the part that will keep you awake if you let it. That is the part that should unsettle you down to the marrow of your bones, because when investigators began the grim work of identifying the bodies and piecing together the lives of the people who died in that house, when the families were contacted and the dental records were matched and the faces beneath the shrouds were given names again, What emerged was not what anyone expected, not what the newspapers wanted, not what the comfortable narrative of Coulter's madhouse required, because what they found were intelligent, educated, capable, accomplished human beings, people who by any conventional measure of competence and normalcy had been functioning, contributing, thoughtful members of society before they joined this group, people you might have worked alongside or lived next door to or sat beside on a train, without ever suspecting that they carried inside them a belief so immense and so absolute that they would one day die for it. And among the dead were computer programmers and web designers, skilled technologists who had built and operated one of the earliest professional website development companies in the burgeoning internet economy of the mid-1990s, a business called Higher Source that had real clients and real contracts and real revenue, a company that had designed websites for the San Diego Polo Club, for a Christian music convention, for a topographical mapping firm, for local businesses that needed a presence on this strange new thing called the World Wide Web. And these were people who understood code and servers and HTML and the emerging architecture of the digital world. People who were not living in some haze of technological ignorance, but were in fact more technologically literate than most Americans in 1997. People who sat at their computers during the day building functional, professional websites for paying clients, and then in the evening gathered with their fellow members to discuss the imminent arrival of a spacecraft from the next level. And among them was Thomas Nichols, a quiet, gentle man who happened to be the brother of Nichelle Nichols, the actress who had played Lieutenant Uhura on Star Trek, a connection that would later strike journalists as almost too symbolically perfect, the brother of a woman who had pretended to travel among the stars dying because he believed he actually would. And there were musicians and visual artists among the dead, and a former car dealer from Texas who had given up a comfortable living to follow Applewhite, and a woman who had worked as a librarian, and people with master's degrees and doctoral coursework, and people who had served honorably in the United States military, and people who had raised children and maintained marriages and held down demanding jobs for years or decades before walking away from all of it. And the youngest member to die was 26 years old, barely into adulthood, and the oldest was 72, a person who had lived through the Depression and the Second World War, and the Civil Rights Movement and the moon landing and the fall of the Berlin Wall, someone who had seen enough of life to develop what you would think would be an unshakable sense of reality. And some of these 39 people, had been members of this group for over 20 years, 2 full decades of daily commitment, of rising each morning and organising their lives around a cosmology that most outsiders would find incomprehensible. 2 decades of slowly and methodically disassembling their former identities, their former names, their former desires, their former selves, and rebuilding themselves from the ground up according to a blueprint drawn by a man they believed was a representative of God, or rather of something beyond God as most people understood the concept, and this is the question that haunts the story of Heaven's Gate. This is the question that makes it more than a tabloid curiosity or a late-night television punchline about sneakers and comets. The question is simply, how? How does this happen? How does a rational, intelligent, well-educated human being come to believe something so spectacularly far removed from consensus reality that they will calmly, cheerfully, even eagerly eat poison and put a plastic bag over their head and lie down to die beside 38 other people who are doing exactly the same thing while waiting for a spaceship that does not exist? And the answer to that question is not simple, and it is not comfortable, and it does not allow you the luxury of believing that it could never happen to you, and it begins not in 1997 but decades earlier, long before anyone had heard of Heaven's Gate or Hale Bop, in the dusty, wind-scoured flatlands of West Texas, in a small town called Spur, population roughly 1,200 souls, a place of cotton fields and cattle ranches and Baptist churches and Friday night football games, where in 1931 a boy named Marshall Herff Applewhite was born into the household of a Presbyterian minister named Marshall Herff Applewhite Sr., and to understand what happened in that mansion in Rancho Santa Fe, you must first understand this man, this strange, brilliant, deeply tormented, magnetically charismatic, profoundly complicated man who had spent his entire adult life searching for something he could never quite name, reaching towards something he could never quite grasp, an answer, a framework, a meaning large enough to contain the storm that raged inside him. And Marshall Applewhite grew up immersed in the church, steeped in scripture and hymns and the solemn rhythms of Protestant worship, surrounded by the language and the imagery and the assumptions of a faith that promises salvation to the faithful and damnation to the wicked, a faith that teaches that the body is a temporary vessel and the soul is eternal, that suffering has a divine purpose, that the visible world is merely a shadow of a greater reality that lies beyond death. And his father was a respected and committed minister who moved the family through several small Texas congregations, and young Marshall absorbed it all, absorbed it so deeply that it became the substrate of his thinking, the bedrock upon which every subsequent idea would be built, and he was gifted, genuinely and remarkably gifted, especially in music, blessed with a rich, resonant baritone voice that could fill a church sanctuary or a concert hall, a voice that people remembered years later, a voice that could make the hairs on the back of your neck stand up when he sang a hymn or an aria, and he pursued that gift with discipline and ambition, studying music at Austin College in Sherman, Texas, a small Presbyterian liberal arts school, and then earning a master's degree in music from the University of Colorado at Boulder. And he was tall and handsome, with sharp features and intense, penetrating eyes that seemed to look not at you but into you, and he was possessed of that rare and dangerous quality that certain people have, that ineffable charisma, that ability to walk into a room and shift the energy of it, to make everyone present feel as though they had been waiting for him without knowing it, as though his arrival completed something, as though his attention, when he turned it upon you, was a kind of benediction, a light that illuminated whatever it touched and made it feel significant and real. And he married a woman named Ann Pierce, and they had 2 children, a son and a daughter, and for a time the surface of his life looked like everything a man of his era and his background and his social class was supposed to want. It looked like success. It looked like the American dream rendered in the specific dialect of an educated Southern Protestant in the middle of the 20th century, and he taught music at the University of Alabama for a time, and then he joined the faculty of the University of St. Thomas in Houston, a small Catholic liberal arts university where he directed the theatre program and threw himself into staging operas and musicals with the kind of total, consuming passion that left everyone around him simultaneously exhausted and exhilarated, and he earned a reputation as a demanding, inspiring, electrifying presence in the classroom and on the rehearsal stage, the kind of teacher who did not merely instruct but transformed, who could take a timid sophomore and turn them into a performer, who could make you feel that what you were doing on that stage was not just a college production, but something that mattered, something urgent, something necessary, that art itself was a kind of sacred act, and his students adored him with the fierce, almost devotional loyalty that great teachers sometimes inspire, and his colleagues respected him even if they found him intense. And beneath all of this, beneath the charm and the talent and the professional accomplishments and the handsome family and the respected position, Marshall Applewhite was falling apart, quietly, invisibly, catastrophically. He was a man at war with himself in the most fundamental way a person can be because Marshall Applewhite was gay, or at the very least powerfully attracted to men, in an era and a culture and a religious tradition and a part of the country that offered absolutely no framework for understanding or accepting or even acknowledging that fact, in a time when homosexuality was classified as a mental illness by the American Psychiatric Association and was a criminal offense in the state of Texas, and was considered by the Presbyterian Church in which he had been raised to be a sin of the gravest order, and the conflict between his desires and his beliefs, between the insistent truth of his body and the rigid demands of his theology, between who he was in the privacy of his own heart and who he believed God required him to be, was tearing him apart, splitting him down the middle like a tree struck by lightning. And in the late 1960s the fissure became visible, his carefully constructed life began to crack and then to shatter, and he was dismissed from his position at the University of St. Thomas under circumstances that were never fully disclosed, but that were widely and persistently rumoured to involve a sexual relationship with a male student, and his marriage to Ann Pierce collapsed under the weight of secrets that could no longer be carried, and he left Houston and drifted westward to New Mexico, taking odd jobs, teaching voice lessons, singing in small venues, growing increasingly isolated and increasingly desperate, and increasingly convinced that there was something profoundly wrong not just with him but with the world itself, that the ordinary structures of human life, marriage and career and social respectability were somehow insufficient, somehow false, somehow a cage that was preventing him from becoming what he was meant to become, and he began to have what he described as profound spiritual experiences, visions of light and purpose, revelations that came to him in the night like messages from a distant transmitter, a growing, overwhelming sense that he had been chosen for something enormous, something of cosmic significance, something that would redeem not just his own suffering but the suffering of the entire human race, and whether these experiences were genuine mystical events, the kind of numinous encounters that saints and prophets have reported throughout history, or whether they were the symptoms of a mind under extraordinary psychological pressure. A psyche fragmenting under the impossible weight of shame and self-denial is a question that perhaps cannot be answered from the outside, that perhaps does not even have an answer, but what is certain is that they were real to him, overwhelmingly and consumingly and unshakably real, more real than the physical world around him, more real than his own body, and in 1970 or early 1971, broken and searching, he checked himself into a psychiatric facility in Houston, seeking treatment for what he described to the intake staff as unwanted homosexual urges, hoping that the cold clinical machinery of institutional psychiatry could do what willpower and prayer and marriage and career and the sheer force of his own considerable intellect had not been able to do, hoping that someone in that hospital could reach inside him and switch off the part of himself that he could not accept, could not live with, could not reconcile with the God he had been taught to worship, and it was there, in that hospital, in that sterile purgatory of white walls and fluorescent lighting, and the quiet shuffle of sedated patients in paper slippers, moving through linoleum corridors that smelled of antiseptic and institutional coffee, that he met the woman who would change everything, who would take the raw material of his anguish and his charisma, and his desperate need for meaning and shape it into something that neither of them could have imagined alone. A nurse named Bonnie Lou Nettles, and their meeting is one of those strange conjunctions of personality and timing, and mutual need, and shared damage that history occasionally produces, those improbable collisions between two people who are each carrying half of a key that only works when the two halves are brought together, and Bonnie Nettles was not like Marshall Applewhite in the ways that were immediately visible. She was quieter, softer spoken, less overtly commanding, more bookish and inward-turning, a middle-aged registered nurse with 4 children and a marriage that was also crumbling, a woman who did her job competently and raised her kids and paid her bills and from the outside looked like any other overworked nurse in any other hospital in Houston, Texas. But she carried within her a vast and elaborate and deeply strange inner world that she had been building and furnishing for years, a world populated by spirits and cosmic forces and astrological configurations and messages from entities that existed beyond the veil of ordinary perception, because Bonnie Nettles was deeply, passionately interested in astrology and theosophy and channeling, and the writings of Helena Blavatsky, and the teachings of various esoteric traditions that promised access to hidden knowledge and higher planes of existence, and she believed with quiet but unshakable conviction that she was in contact with spiritual beings from other dimensions, that she received messages and guidance from a 19th century monk she called Brother Francis, that the universe was far stranger and more purposeful and more intricately designed than the bland materialism of modern medicine or modern religion would have you believe. And when she met Marshall Applewhite, something clicked into place between them, with an almost audible snap. Something recognized something. His intensity found her certainty. His desperation found her calm. His hunger for meaning found her elaborate map of the cosmos, and within a remarkably short time, weeks rather than months, they had developed a shared conviction that was breathtaking in its scope and its audacity, and its total, serene indifference to what anyone else might think of it. They believed that they were the 2 witnesses described in chapter 11 of the Book of Revelation, the 2 prophets who, according to Scripture, would prophesy for 1260 days and then be killed by the beast that ascends from the bottomless pit. And their bodies would lie in the street for 3.5 days while the people of the earth rejoiced over their death, and then the breath of life from God would enter them, and they would stand upon their feet and ascend to heaven in a cloud while their enemies watched in terror. And this was not metaphor to Applewhite and Nettles. This was not allegory or poetry or symbolic interpretation. This was literal, operational logistical truth, a mission briefing, a set of instructions. They were here on assignment, sent by the next level, by an advanced extraterrestrial civilization that existed outside and above the physical universe as humans understood it, and their job, their sacred and cosmically urgent assignment, was to gather a flock, to find the other souls who had been seeded on Earth by agents of the next level, souls that were sleeping inside human bodies like seeds dormant in winter soil, to awaken those souls to their true identity and their true purpose, and to lead them home home to the next level, home to the kingdom that existed beyond the stars, and they left Houston together, left their crumbling marriages and their bewildered children and their professional obligations and everything that tethered them to the ordinary world, and they began driving across the vast spaces of the American West in a beat-up car with the windows down and the radio off. Two middle-aged seekers in the enormous, myth-soaked landscape of 1970s America, an era of spiritual experimentation and cultural upheaval, and restless, hungry searching, when ashrams and communes and encounter groups and transcendental meditation centers were blooming across the country like wildflowers after rain, when the old certainties of church and state and family had been shaken by Vietnam and Watergate, and the sexual revolution, and the civil rights movement, and the assassinations, and the general sense that the foundations of American life were cracking. And into this landscape of broken certainties and desperate seeking came Bo and Peep, as they called themselves at first, a pair of names that were folksy and almost playful, shepherds calling their sheep, names that belied the cosmic grandiosity of the claims behind them, and later they would rename themselves Do and T, musical designations, the first in the eighth notes of the major scale, the root and the octave, the foundation and its perfect harmonic return, and the theology they constructed together over months and years of conversation and revelation and mutual refinement was a strange and intricate and surprisingly coherent creation, a bricolage assembled from the broken fragments of 20th century American spiritual culture, and if you listen carefully to the teachings of Heaven's Gate, you can hear every source, every ingredient, like tasting the individual spices in a complex dish. You can hear the Christianity of Applewhite's childhood, in the language of salvation and resurrection and ascension, and the soul's journey beyond the mortal body. You can hear the theosophy and New Age mysticism of Nettles in the talk of spiritual vibrations and evolutionary levels and cosmic hierarchies, and the refinement of consciousness. You can hear the UFO mythology that had been percolating through American popular culture since Kenneth Arnold's sighting over Mount Rainier in 1947, and the alleged crash at Roswell in the spaceships, and the extraterrestrial beings and the government cover-ups. And you can hear science fiction, especially Star Trek, in the vocabulary of away teams and crew members and missions and the next level imagined as a kind of cosmic starfleet, a benevolent advanced civilization watching over less developed worlds and occasionally sending representatives down to guide them. And all of these elements, the Christian, the theosophical, the ufological, the science fictional, were melted down and poured into a single mould, fused together into a belief system that was internally consistent, even as it was externally bizarre. A system that had an answer for every question and a framework for every experience. And the core of that system, the beating heart of the theology of Heaven's Gate, was this: that human beings are not what they appear to be, that the body you inhabit, the flesh and bone and blood that you call yourself, is not you. It is a vehicle, a container, a biological suit that your real self is wearing for the duration of its stay on this planet, the way an astronaut wears a spacesuit for the duration of a spacewalk. And your real self, your true identity, is a soul, a deposit of consciousness that was placed inside this human vehicle by members of the next level, planted here like a seed in a carefully tended garden. And Earth itself is that garden, a laboratory, a greenhouse, a school where souls are given the opportunity and the challenge to grow and develop and overcome the limitations of the physical world and eventually graduate to the next level, which is not heaven in the traditional Christian sense, but rather an actual, physical, literal place, a civilization of perfected beings who have evolved beyond the need for human bodies and human emotions and human attachments and human reproduction, beings of pure purpose and consciousness who serve the universe in ways that humans cannot comprehend, and to graduate to earn your passage from the human level to the level above human, you must overcome everything that Applewhite called the human mammalian level. You must systematically shed every attachment that ties you to the experience of being human. You must give up your family, because family is an attachment to the human level. You must give up romantic love, because romantic love is an attachment. You must give up sexual desire in all its forms, because sexuality is the deepest and most persistent attachment of the mammalian vehicle. You must give up your birth name, because your name is a label attached to the vehicle, not to the soul. You must give up your individual personality and your personal preferences and your private ambitions, because individuality itself is an illusion generated by the vehicle. You must give up comfort and pleasure and entertainment and vanity, and every small human satisfaction that makes you feel like a specific person living a specific life. Because all of that, every bit of it, is the vehicle talking, the container trying to convince you that it is you, trying to keep you trapped in the human level, trying to prevent you from hearing the signal that the next level is broadcasting, and the real you, the soul, the next level being dormant inside the vehicle, wants only one thing: to shed the vehicle and go home, to return to the level above human, to rejoin the crew, and do and tea with a representative sent down from that level to show you the way. And let yourself notice something about this theology. Let it drift into your awareness like a leaf falling on still water. Because this elaborate, strange, internally consistent cosmic architecture did something very specific and very powerful for Marshall Applewhite. It solved his deepest and most agonizing problem. It did not merely explain his suffering, it sanctified it. It ennobled it. It transformed his lifelong inability to accept his own sexuality from a source of crushing shame and psychological torment into a spiritual achievement, a mark of advancement, a sign that his soul was already outgrowing its vehicle. Because if the body is just a container, then its desires are meaningless noise. If the goal of existence is to transcend the human mammalian level, then sexual desire of any kind, heterosexual or homosexual, is simply static, interference, the vehicle trying to distract the soul from its mission. And in this framework, Marshall Applewhite was not a broken man hiding from himself. He was not a closeted gay man in a homophobic society, destroying himself with denial. He was an advanced soul, a next-level being who had voluntarily incarnated in a flawed human vehicle in order to carry out the most important mission in the history of this planet, and his struggle with desire was not weakness, but evidence of the soul's effort to break free. And this is a pattern that you see again and again in the psychology of cult leaders, a pattern so consistent that it might as well be a law of nature, the way personal wounds become theological principles, the way private shame is alchemized into cosmic doctrine, the way the specific, unique, idiosyncratic pain of one person is universalized into a framework that explains the suffering of all people. And in September of 1975, after months of travelling and refining their message and gathering small clusters of followers in various cities, Applewhite and Nettles organised a public meeting in Waldport, Oregon, a small, quiet coastal town of roughly 2,000 people nestled between the Siuslaw National Forest and the grey waters of the central Oregon coast, a town of fishermen and retirees and artists, and the kind of gentle, open-minded seekers who drifted to small Pacific Northwest communities in the 1970s, looking for a simpler, more authentic life, and a flyer had been posted around town. A simple flyer that promised information about how to physically ascend to the next evolutionary level aboard a spacecraft, UFO, and on the appointed evening the meeting room was full, packed with curious locals and spiritual seekers and drifters, and people who had perhaps seen one too many late-night television specials about flying saucers. And Applewhite and Nettles stood at the front of that room and they spoke. They spoke for hours with the conviction and the passion and the absolute unblinking certainty of people who know something that you do not, who have seen something that you have not, who carry a truth so enormous that the mere act of sharing it fills them with a kind of luminous, almost unbearable urgency. And Applewhite was magnetic. He was mesmerizing. His voice filled the room and his eyes moved across the crowd, and each person he looked at felt personally addressed, personally recognized, personally called, and when they were finished speaking, when the questions had been asked and answered, when every objection had been met, with a response that was calm and reasonable and coherent within the framework they had laid out, roughly 20 people stood up from their folding chairs in that community room in Waldport, Oregon, and walked out of that building and never went back to their former lives. 20 adults, some of them young and some of them middle-aged, some of them educated and some of them not, left their families and their jobs and their mortgages and their pets and their refrigerators full of food and their half-read novels on their nightstands, and followed two strangers they had met that evening into the desert, into the wilderness, into a life of wandering and discipline and renunciation that would last for decades. And this is the moment that demands the most careful psychological examination. This is the hinge point where the story tips from strange to disturbing. Because how does that happen? How do 20 functioning adults hear a presentation about alien souls and spaceship evacuations and the level above human, and choose in the space of a single evening to abandon everything they know and follow two people they just met into the unknown? And the answer lies in understanding something deeply uncomfortable about human psychology. something that challenges the flattering story we tell ourselves about the relationship between intelligence and vulnerability, which is that intelligence does not protect you from belief. In fact, intelligence can make you dramatically more susceptible to certain kinds of belief, not less. Because intelligent people are better at rationalizing, they are more skilled at constructing elaborate, internally consistent justifications for positions they have already emotionally committed to. They are better at pattern recognition and at finding connections and resonances between disparate ideas, and they are better at building mental models that feel comprehensive and explanatory. And a highly intelligent person who encounters a belief system like the one Applewhite and Nettles were offering does not simply swallow it whole the way popular culture imagines cult members do. They do not check their brains at the door. Instead, they engage with it intellectually, they probe it, they test it against their existing knowledge. They ask difficult questions, and because the system is internally consistent, because it has been designed, consciously or unconsciously, to have an answer for everything, because every objection can be met with a response that makes sense within the framework, the intelligent person's own formidable analytical capacity becomes the very mechanism of their entrapment. They think their way into the trap. Their intelligence becomes the lock rather than the key. And there is another factor, a factor that is perhaps even more important than intelligence, which is the factor of need, existential need, spiritual hunger, the deep human craving for meaning and purpose and certainty. Because the people who followed Applewhite and Nettles out of that meeting room in Waldport were not randomly selected from the general population. They were people who were already searching, already hungry, already aware of an emptiness inside them that nothing in their conventional lives had been able to fill. People who had looked at the standard offerings of American society in the confused and disillusioning mid-1970s, the corporate career ladder, the suburban nuclear family, the consumer lifestyle with its promise that happiness could be purchased at the mall, the mainline Protestant and Catholic churches with their increasingly tepid and unconvincing reassurances, and had found all of it profoundly, achingly insufficient, had found all of it unable to answer the questions that burned inside them like coals that would not go out. Questions like, why am I here? What is the purpose of this brief and painful existence? Is there something more than this? Does my suffering mean anything? Is anyone in charge? Does anyone know the way? And into this landscape of unanswered questions and unmet needs walked Marshall Applewhite with his penetrating eyes and his resonant voice and his absolute certainty, and he offered answers, not tentative, hedging, probabilistic answers of the kind that honest philosophers and scientists offer, but definitive, comprehensive, cosmically scaled, architecturally complete answers that explained everything, that left no question unanswered, that provided a framework so total and so internally coherent that once you stepped inside it, the entire universe suddenly made sense, and he offered community to people who felt isolated, deep and immediate belonging to a group of fellow seekers who understood them in ways that their families and friends never had, and he offered purpose to people who felt purposeless, not just ordinary purpose, not just a job or a cause, but cosmic purpose, a mission assigned by the highest intelligence in the universe, and above all he offered the most intoxicating promise that any human being can make to another human being, which is the promise that you are special, that you're not ordinary, that you were chosen, deliberately and specifically chosen, that you're not just a random collection of atoms stumbling through a meaningless universe toward an anonymous death, but a seed planted by an advanced civilization, a soul on a mission, a being with a destiny so grand that it spans galaxies, and that promise, delivered with genuine conviction by someone who radiates absolute certainty, is almost chemically impossible to resist for a person who is already searching, already hungry, already standing in the gap between the question and the silence that follows. And so they followed him, and the group began to travel, nomadic and secretive, camping in the wilderness of Colorado and Wyoming and New Mexico, sleeping in tents under the enormous western sky, moving from state to state in a caravan of aging vehicles, and they were given new names to replace their birth names, names that severed the connection to their former identities, and they were assigned partners called check partners who monitored each other's behavior and thoughts and reported deviations to Do and TI, and they were required to cut off all contact with their families, to surrender their money and their possessions and their personal belongings, to dress alike and eat alike and think alike, and the long, slow, patient, almost imperceptible process of identity dissolution began. The gradual erasure of the individual self, like water wearing away stone, like wind smoothing the features from a sculpture, so slowly that at no single point could you identify the moment when a free person became a follower and the media caught wind of them. These strange UFO cultists wandering the American wilderness, and reporters tracked them down and interviewed bewildered family members and wrote stories that were mocking and derisive and dripping with condescension, headlines about the kooks and the crazies and the people who gave up everything to wait for a flying saucer, and the ridicule was intense and it stung, and it also served Applewhite's purposes perfectly, because ridicule from the outside world confirmed what he had told his followers from the beginning, that the world would not understand them, that the world would mock and persecute them, just as it had mocked and persecuted every prophet and every messenger throughout history, and the mockery became proof that they were on the right path, became evidence that the world was exactly the hostile, spiritually blind place that Duanty had described, and in late 1975 and into 1976 the group retreated from public view, went underground, disappeared into the vast interior spaces of the American West like water, soaking into sand, and they tightened their discipline, they intensified their practices, they drew the circle closer and cut the last fraying threads that still connected some of their members to the world they had left behind. And this is where we leave them for now, in the silence, in the wilderness, in the strange liminal space between the world they had abandoned and the world they believed was waiting for them among the stars. A small band of seekers huddled around two people who claimed to be messengers from a civilization beyond human comprehension, sleeping in their tents while the coyotes called to each other across the dark arroyos and the stars burned overhead in configurations that Bonnie Nettles read like scripture. And the years ahead of them would be long and strange and full of transformation and loss and deepening commitment and escalating control. And the comet was still out there, decades away, still hurtling through the outer reaches of the solar system on its immense elliptical orbit, still invisible, still unknown, still just another piece of ice and rock tumbling through the void, but already on its way, already coming, already falling inward toward the sun and toward the date that would give it a name and a place in history. And in the silence of the desert night, Marshall Applewhite lay awake in his tent staring at the canvas above him, his mind constructing cathedrals of belief in the darkness, building and rebuilding the architecture of salvation that would one day lead 39 people to lie down in a mansion in the hills above San Diego and pull plastic bags over their heads and close their eyes forever. And the wind moved through the sagebrush and the stars turned slowly overhead, and the world was vast and dark and ancient and full of questions that no one, not the wisest philosopher, not the most devout saint, not the most brilliant scientist, not the most desperate seeker among us, has ever been able to answer. And that is the space where cults are born, in the gap between the question and the silence that follows it, in the unbearable ache of not knowing, in the deep and ancient and profoundly human need to believe that someone, somewhere, somehow, knows the way home. So let yourself breathe, slowly, deeply. Let the story settle around you like a blanket in the darkness. Let the questions it raises drift through your mind like clouds moving across a night sky, without grasping at them, without trying to answer them, just letting them be. Because there is more to tell, much more. The years of isolation, and intensifying discipline, and the slow tightening of control, and the death of Bonnie Nettles, and the castrations, and the emergence onto the early internet, and the final descent toward that mansion, and that comet, and those purple shrouds. But all of that is for another night, and for now just rest, just breathe, and let the darkness hold you gently, and know that the story will be here when you return, patient and waiting, like a light in the window of a house at the end of a long and winding road, and sleep now, sleep, and we will walk further into this strange and terrible garden together when you are ready. And so they vanished. After the strange gathering in Walport, Oregon, after the headlines and the mockery and the television cameras, after the reporters called them kooks and the comedians made them punchlines, Marshall Applewhite and Bonnie Nettles simply disappeared. They took their followers, roughly 24 souls who had already abandoned jobs, marriages, children, entire lives, and they walked straight into the American wilderness, and for years, almost no one heard from them again. Think about that for a moment. Let that settle into you like water into dry earth. In an age before social media, before GPS tracking, Before the digital tether that now binds every human being to a grid of visibility, it was possible to simply cease to exist in the public record, and that is precisely what they did. The group drifted across the American West like a ghost caravan, moving through the deserts of New Mexico, the scrublands of Texas, the mountain passes of Colorado, the vast and featureless expanses of Wyoming and Utah and Nevada. They lived in tents, they slept in vans and station wagons and the occasional rented campground. They cooked over open fires. They held their meetings under the stars in places so remote that the nearest town might be 50 miles of empty highway in any direction. And this isolation, this deliberate withdrawal from the world, was not accidental. It was not merely a consequence of having nowhere else to go. It was the architecture of control being built, beam by beam, wall by wall, around the minds of every person in that group. The psychologist Robert J. Lifton, in his landmark study of thought reform, identified a principle he called milieu control, the systematic regulation of all information and communication that reaches a person, the construction of a sealed environment in which only approved ideas are permitted to circulate. When you are camped in the desert with no television, no radio, no newspapers, no telephone, no contact with anyone outside the group, when the only voices you hear are the voices of your fellow travellers and the voice of your leader interpreting reality for you, then reality itself becomes whatever your leader says it is. There is no competing signal. There is no dissenting opinion arriving through the mail or over the airwaves. There is only the narrative, endlessly reinforced, endlessly repeated, becoming more real with each telling, more solid, more unquestionable, until it is not a belief at all anymore, but simply the way things are, the way things have always been, the way things were always meant to be. And in that desert silence, in that enormous American emptiness, Applewhite and Nettles refine their cosmology with the patience of scholars and the certainty of prophets. They were no longer Bo and Peep, those whimsical shepherd names from the Waldport days. They were now T and Do, musical notes. Ty, the higher note, was Bonnie Nettles. Do, the foundational tone, was Marshall Applewhite. And beneath them, the followers were reorganized, renamed, remade. Each member was given a new name, a strange, distinctive naming convention that stripped away every trace of their former identity. 3 letters followed by the suffix Odi, Sorodi, Junodi, Lvodi, Ursidi. Names that sounded like nothing, that connected to nothing, that belonged to no culture, no family, no history. That was the point. You were not the person you had been. You were not Sarah or John or Margaret or David. You were not your parents' child. You were not anyone's spouse or sibling or friend. You were a soul temporarily housed in a biological vehicle, a container, and the name on that container was a designation, a serial number for the next level, nothing more. And the containers themselves were made uniform. Everyone wore the same clothing, loose, shapeless, androgynous garments that erased all distinction between male and female, between young and old, between one body and another. They cut their hair short identically. They looked alike. They moved alike. They spoke in the same careful, measured cadence that Applewhite himself used, that gentle, almost hypnotic evenness of tone that you may have heard if you have ever watched the recruitment videos he would later produce. The erasure of individuality was total and deliberate, and it served a function as old as the first monastery and the first military barracks. When you cannot distinguish yourself from the group, you begin to think of yourself as the group, and the group's beliefs become your beliefs not through argument or persuasion, but through the simple dissolution of the boundary between self and collective. And then there were the check partners. This was one of the most psychologically ingenious mechanisms of control that Applewhite and Nettles devised. Every member of the group was paired with another member, and these pairs were responsible for monitoring each other. Not just behaviour, thoughts. You were expected to confess your doubts, your temptations, your moments of wavering faith, your memories of the life you had left behind, your longing for the people you had loved and abandoned. And your check partner was expected to report these confessions, these lapses, these dangerous residues of your former human self, to the leadership. It was mutual surveillance dressed as spiritual partnership. It was the Stasi model applied to the soul. And the most devastating aspect of it was this. You could never be alone with your own doubts. You could never sit quietly with the small, still voice in the back of your mind that whispered, "This is wrong, this doesn't make sense, I want to go home." Because that voice, the moment it spoke, had to be shared, examined, treated as a symptom of spiritual illness, a sign that you were still too attached to your vehicle, too human, too earthly, too contaminated by the world you were supposed to have left behind. Doubt itself became evidence of failure, and the only cure for doubt was deeper commitment. The only answer to the question, why am I doing this, was to do more, give more, surrender more. And they did. Sexuality was forbidden entirely. Not merely discouraged, not merely regulated, but abolished. Applewhite taught that sexual desire was the ultimate expression of the human animal, the deepest chain binding the soul to its biological vehicle, and that to achieve the next level that chain had to be broken completely. No sexual contact of any kind, no romantic attachment, no flirtation, no lingering glances, no private conversations between people who might be attracted to each other. The check partner system helped enforce this. If you felt desire, you confessed it, and it was treated with the same gravity as a relapse in an addiction program. And for some members, even this was not enough. The desire itself, the mere capacity for it, felt like a contamination that could not be washed away by willpower alone. And so, several male members of the group, including Applewhite himself, travelled to Mexico, where they underwent voluntary castration. Pause on that. Let the weight of it settle. These were men who had once lived ordinary lives. They had been professors, musicians, engineers, fathers, and they voluntarily submitted to the surgical removal of their testicles because a former music teacher from Texas told them it was necessary to board a spaceship. The procedure was not performed in a hospital. It was not performed by board-certified surgeons. It was performed across the border in circumstances that we can only describe as crude, and the men returned to the group and were celebrated for their commitment, their willingness to sacrifice the last vestige of their earthly nature in pursuit of the next level. And here we arrive at one of the most important psychological principles in understanding not just Heaven's Gate, but every high-demand group, every cult, every closed system of belief that escalates its requirements over time. It is the principle of escalating commitment, and it is rooted in Leon Festinger's theory of cognitive dissonance, and it works like this. When a person has invested something of value, time, money, effort, reputation, in a course of action, and then encounters evidence that the course of action is mistaken, they experience a painful internal conflict. The evidence says you are wrong, but your investment says you cannot be wrong, because if you are wrong, then everything you have given is wasted and you are a fool and your suffering was meaningless. And the human mind, faced with this unbearable tension, almost always resolves it in the same direction, not by accepting the evidence and cutting losses, but by doubling down on the commitment, by finding new reasons to believe, by reinterpreting the disconfirming evidence as secretly confirming, by investing even more so that the stakes become even higher, and the possibility of admitting error becomes even more unthinkable. This is the sunk cost fallacy applied not to money or time, but to identity itself. When you have given up your name, your family, your career, your sexuality, your bodily autonomy, your connection to every person who ever loved you, when you have literally allowed parts of your body to be cut away in service of the belief, then admitting that the belief is false is not merely an intellectual adjustment. It is the annihilation of the self. It is admitting that you destroyed your own life for nothing. And almost no one can do that. Almost no one can look into that abyss and accept what they see. And so they believe harder. They commit deeper. They interpret every new demand not as evidence of exploitation, but as evidence of progress, because the alternative is a darkness too complete to endure. And year after year, the group moved through the desert, and the demands grew, and the belief solidified, and the outside world faded into something distant and unreal, a place they had once inhabited the way a butterfly had once been a caterpillar, a former state, a lower form, something they had graduated beyond. Somewhere out there, beyond the campfire light, beyond the rim of the mesa, there were parents who still set a place at Thanksgiving dinner for the child who had disappeared. There were spouses who still slept on one side of the bed, leaving the other side empty out of habit, out of hope, out of a refusal to accept that the person they loved had chosen a stranger's vision of heaven over the life they had built together. There were children growing up without a mother or a father, told only that mommy or daddy had gone away, told nothing that made sense, because nothing about it did make sense, not from the outside, not from the world of mortgages and school plays and Sunday dinners and all the ordinary human rituals that the group had declared meaningless. And the members themselves, did they think of these people? Did they lie awake in their sleeping bags under the desert stars and feel the pull of those abandoned lives? Of course they did. They were human. They could not help it. But the system had an answer for that pull, that ache, that midnight homesickness. It was the vehicle talking. It was the human animal with its mammalian need for bonding trying to drag the soul back down to the level it was trying to leave. The ache was not love. The ache was gravity. And you had to push through it the way a rocket pushes through the atmosphere, with force, with fire, with the absolute commitment to escape velocity. And then, in 1985, something happened that should have shattered the entire edifice. Bonnie Nettles, Tai, the higher note, the one who had started it all, the one who had first told Applewhite that they were the two witnesses from the Book of Revelation, the one who channeled the messages from the next level, the co-leader, the co-prophet, the spiritual authority that even Applewhite deferred to. Bonnie Nettles was diagnosed with cancer, liver cancer, and it spread as cancer does, silently and relentlessly through her body, and no spacecraft came to collect her, and no beings from the next level intervened to heal her. And she did not ascend in a column of light or vanish into a higher dimension. She lay in a hospital bed, in a hospital gown, connected to tubes and monitors, and she suffered, and she diminished, and she died. June 19th, 1985. Bonnie Lou Nettles, age 57, dead of metastatic cancer in a Dallas hospital. A human death. An ordinary death. The kind of death that happens to hundreds of thousands of people every year, unremarkable in every way except for the extraordinary claims that had been built around the person it happened to. This should have been the end. By every rational measure, by every logical standard, this should have been the moment when the followers looked at each other and said, "Wait, she told us she would be taken up by a spacecraft. She told us she had graduated beyond the human condition. She told us the next level was real, and she was its representative. And now she is dead of cancer in a hospital like anyone else's grandmother. How do we explain this? How do we continue to believe? But if you have understood everything that came before, the isolation, the identity erasure, the escalating commitment, the years of sacrifice, the mutual surveillance, the psychological impossibility of admitting error after giving up everything, then you already know what happened. They did not stop believing. They believed differently. And this is perhaps the most remarkable demonstration of a principle that Festiner himself documented decades earlier in his classic study, When Prophecy Fails. When a deeply held belief is disconfirmed by undeniable evidence, the believers do not abandon the belief. They modify it. They reframe the disconfirmation as a deeper confirmation that they had simply misunderstood. And Marshall Applewhite, whatever else he was a master of reframing. T had not died, he told his followers. T had graduated. She had moved to the next level ahead of schedule. Her body, her vehicle, had simply been a container she no longer needed, and she had discarded it the way you might discard a worn-out suit of clothes. The cancer was not a failure of the next level to protect her. It was the mechanism by which she shed her container. She was now operating from the next level itself, guiding them from above, more powerful than she had ever been in physical form. Death was not death. Death was promotion. Death was liberation. Death was the ultimate proof that the teaching was true, because T had demonstrated through her own departure exactly what they were all preparing to do. And the followers accepted this. They accepted it because they had to, because the alternative was a void they could not face, because 12 years of sacrifice and isolation and identity dissolution had left them with no other framework for understanding reality, no other language for describing their experience, no other community to return to, no other selves to return to being. And Applewhite, now alone at the top of the hierarchy, now the sole voice of authority, the only remaining link to the next level, began to reshape the theology in ways that were subtly but profoundly darker than anything that had come before. Without T to moderate him, without T to share the burden of prophecy, without T to serve as a check on his own psychology. And remember, Applewhite was a man who had struggled with his sexuality, who had been institutionalized, who carried deep wells of shame and self-loathing that he had transmuted into a cosmic narrative of transcendence. Without T, the theology began to tilt toward its final, fatal form. In the years after T's death, some members did leave. The departure of the co-founder was too much for certain followers to reconcile, and they quietly slipped away, back into the world they had abandoned, carrying with them the strange and heavy burden of years spent in a reality that no longer existed for them, but most stayed. Most looked at Applewhite and saw not a man whose fundamental promise had been broken, but a leader who had been refined by loss, who now carried the authority of both witnesses in a single vessel, who had absorbed T's departure and emerged stronger, more certain, more connected to the next level than ever before. And for those who stayed, the bond only deepened, the way survivors of a shared ordeal are bound together by the mere fact of their survival, by the knowledge that they endured what others could not. The group gradually emerged from its nomadic period in the late 1980s. They settled into rented properties, first in the Denver area, then in various locations across the Southwest. And something unexpected happened. They adapted to the modern world with remarkable efficiency. These people who had spent years living in tents and vans, who had rejected the material world as a lower-level distraction, turned out to be exceptionally skilled with computers. They founded a web design company called Higher Source. They built websites for businesses. They were, by all accounts, talented and professional and reliable. Their clients had no idea they were working with members of an apocalyptic UFO cult. The irony is almost too perfect. A group that rejected the human world was funding its operations by building the infrastructure of that world's newest communication technology, and it was through that technology that they found their way back into the project of recruitment. They created one of the first cult websites on the early internet, a sprawling collection of pages outlining their theology, their history, their invitation to join. In the mid-1990s, when the World Wide Web was still new, still largely unregulated, still a frontier space where anyone could publish anything and reach anyone, Heaven's Gate became arguably the first cult to truly weaponize the internet for recruitment. They posted videos, they posted written testimonials, they posted detailed theological documents. They reached people who would never have encountered them in person, people sitting alone in their rooms in the early hours of the morning, searching for meaning, searching for connection, searching for something that made sense of a world that felt increasingly senseless. And some of those people wrote back, and some of those people joined, and the group grew, modestly but steadily, even as the theology grew darker. Because Applewhite, in his years of solitary authority, had arrived at a conclusion that cast everything that came before in a new and terrible light. The earth, he now taught, was about to be recycled, not merely changed, not merely judged, recycled, wiped clean, reformatted like a hard drive. And here the computer metaphor was deliberate, drawn from the very technology they worked with every day. Everything on the surface of the planet would be destroyed, and a new civilization would be planted, and the billions of human beings living their ordinary lives in their ordinary cities had no idea that they were already dead, already doomed, already irrelevant to the cosmic program that was about to execute its next command. The only escape, the only possible escape, was to leave. Not metaphorically, not spiritually, physically. To have your soul, your essence, your true self, collected by a next-level spacecraft and transported to the level above human, where you would be given a new body, a perfected body, a body free of desire and decay and death. And the way you made yourself available for collection was to exit your vehicle, to leave your body behind, to die, but not to die, because dying implied ending, implied loss, implied tragedy, to exit, to graduate, to shed your container, to move up. The language was meticulous. Every word was chosen to drain the act of self-destruction of its horror and replace it with the vocabulary of achievement, of progress, of joyful transition. You were not killing yourself. You were boarding a ship. You were not ending your life. You were beginning your real life. You were not committing suicide. You were graduating from the human level, the way a student graduates from school, the way a caterpillar graduates from its cocoon, the way T had graduated when she shed her vehicle in that Dallas hospital in 1985. And this linguistic architecture, this careful construction of alternative meaning around the most final of all human acts, was perhaps the most dangerous thing Marshall Applewhite ever created, because language shapes thought, and thought shapes perception, and perception shapes reality. And when your reality has been shaped for 20 years by a closed system of language that has its own words for everything, its own definitions, its own frame of reference that shares almost nothing with the world outside. Then the concepts those words describe begin to feel as natural and inevitable as gravity. Robert Lifton called this loading the language, and it was one of his 8 criteria of thought reform, and it is worth taking a moment now in this stillness, in this quiet space between sleep and waking, to consider all 8 of those criteria and how completely, how perfectly, how almost, textbook precisely Heaven's Gate satisfied every single one. The first criterion is milieu control, the regulation of all information and communication. We have already seen this in the desert years, in the total isolation from outside media, in the construction of an information environment in which only the group's narrative existed. Even after the group settled into houses and worked with computers, even after they had access to the internet and the wider world, the control remained. Members did not browse the web freely. They did not watch television for entertainment. They did not read newspapers or magazines. Every piece of information that entered their awareness was filtered through the lens of the group's theology. The outside world existed only as a source of revenue and a field for recruitment. It was not a source of truth. It could not be, because truth came only from the next level, and the next level spoke only through do. The second criterion is mystical manipulation, the engineering of spontaneous seeming experiences that appear to confirm the group's ideology. Applewhite was a master of this. When something good happened, it was a sign from the next level. When something bad happened, it was a test from the next level. When a member had a dream or a strange feeling or a moment of unusual clarity, it was communication from T, operating from beyond. Every coincidence was a message. Every setback was a lesson. Every emotion was evidence. The entire fabric of daily experience was woven into the mythology so thoroughly that there was no such thing as a neutral event, no such thing as mere chance, no such thing as something that just happened. Everything meant something. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. And when everything confirms your belief, you stop noticing that nothing could possibly disconfirm it. The third criterion is the demand for purity, the division of the world into the absolutely pure and the absolutely impure, with the group representing purity and everything outside representing contamination. In Heaven's Gate, this took the form of the human versus next level distinction. Everything human was lower. Human emotions, human desires, human relationships, human bodies, all of it was contamination, residue, the clinging mud of a level you were supposed to be leaving behind. Purity meant the complete eradication of everything human within yourself. It meant feeling nothing that a human would feel. It meant wanting nothing that a human would want. It meant becoming, as fully as possible, a being of the next level while still trapped in a human container. And since complete eradication of human nature is impossible, since you cannot actually stop being human, the demand for purity created a permanent state of guilt, a permanent sense of falling short, a permanent need for the group's guidance and correction, because you could never be pure enough on your own. The fourth criterion is the cult of confession, the requirement that members publicly or semi-publicly reveal their innermost thoughts, doubts, and transgressions. The check partner system was the primary mechanism for this. You confessed to your partner confessed to you, and these confessions were reported upward, creating a comprehensive surveillance system in which the leadership had access to the interior lives of every member. But confession served another function beyond surveillance. It created vulnerability. When you have told someone your deepest doubts and your most shameful desires, you have given them power over you. You have made yourself naked before them, and that nakedness binds you to the group more tightly than any lock or chain, because leaving the group means leaving behind people who know everything about you, who have seen you at your most exposed, and carrying with you the knowledge that your confessions, your weaknesses, your failures are known and remembered. The fifth criterion is sacred science, the presentation of the group's ideology as an absolute truth that is simultaneously scientifically valid and morally unquestionable. Applewhite's theology was laced with the language of science. He spoke of levels and processes and containers and vehicles and programs and recycling. The next level was not presented as a matter of faith, but as a matter of fact, a reality as concrete and verifiable as the existence of other planets. To question it was not merely to doubt. It was to be ignorant, to be blind, to be so trapped in your human-level thinking that you could not perceive what was obvious to anyone who had opened their eyes. The theology was unfalsifiable, Not because it avoided evidence, but because it had preemptive explanations for every possible piece of contrary evidence. If the spacecraft didn't come, it was because the timing wasn't right. If a member got sick, it was because they hadn't fully shed their human attachments. If the world didn't end when predicted, it was because the prediction had been misunderstood. Every failure was reframed as a deeper success, every disconfirmation as a more subtle confirmation, and the system remained intact, impervious, sealed against reality like a submarine against the ocean. The sixth criterion is loading the language, the development of a specialized vocabulary that constrains thought by constraining the words available to express it. We have already seen this in the terminology of vehicles and containers and exits and graduation. But it went further. The group had words for everything. They had words for types of thoughts that were acceptable and types that were not. They had words for stages of spiritual development. They had words for the forces that opposed them. The Luciferians, the lower forces, the influences that tried to pull souls back down to the human level. And when you can only describe your experience in the language of the group, you can only think about your experience in the categories the group provides, the language becomes a cage built of words, invisible but absolute, and you do not even realize you're inside it because the cage is made of the very tools you use to perceive. The seventh criterion is doctrine over person, the subordination of individual experience to the group's ideology. If your experience contradicts the doctrine, then your experience is wrong. If you feel love for your family, the feeling is a Luciferian influence designed to keep you at the human level. If you feel doubt, the doubt is your vehicle resisting the soul's upward movement. If you feel pain, the pain is the necessary discomfort of growth. Nothing you feel is valid on its own terms. Everything you feel must be interpreted through the doctrine, and the interpretation always, always, always confirms the doctrine. Your inner life is not your own, it belongs to the system. And the eighth and final criterion is the dispensing of existence, the claim that the group has the right to determine who deserves to exist and who does not, who is worthy of life and who is not, who is real and who is merely an empty vessel, a container without a soul, a body without a purpose. Applewhite taught that most human beings were exactly that, empty containers, biological machines operating without souls, irrelevant to the cosmic program. Only those who had been planted with next-level souls, only those who recognized the truth of his teaching and committed to the process of graduation, were truly alive. Everyone else was already dead, already nothing, already scheduled for recycling along with the rest of the planet. And when you believe that, when you truly, deeply, unreservedly believe that the billions of people outside your group are not really alive, are not really conscious, are not really human in any meaningful sense, then their suffering becomes irrelevant, their opinions become meaningless, their pleas for you to come home and be their daughter, or their son, or their mother, or their father, again become nothing more than the noise of machines, the grinding of gears in a system that is about to be shut down. All 8 criteria, every single one. Heaven's Gate did not merely satisfy Lifton's framework. It exemplified it, illustrated it, brought it to life with a completeness that a textbook author could not have improved upon. And the people inside this system, the people living under these 8 interlocking mechanisms of psychological control, were not stupid. They were not weak-minded. They were not the gullible fools that the outside world would later dismiss them as. They were human beings who had been subjected to 2 decades of the most sophisticated thought reform techniques ever deployed outside a state-sponsored program. Techniques refined through years of trial and error. Techniques that exploited the deepest vulnerabilities of human cognition, our need for meaning, our need for belonging, our inability to accept that our sacrifices were wasted, our tendency to trust the people we have trusted before, our willingness to let language do our thinking for us. They were, in the most precise and clinical sense of the word, prisoners. Prisoners of a system so elegant in its construction that they could not see the walls, could not feel the chains, could not even conceive of the possibility that they were captive, because the system had given them a vocabulary in which captivity did not exist, and freedom meant obedience, and death meant graduation, and the cage was the entire universe. And so the years passed. The early 1990s became the mid-1990s. The group settled into a rhythm of work and worship, building websites by day and studying Applewhite's teachings by night. They were quiet, they were disciplined, they were patient, they were waiting, though they might not have used that word, Waiting implied uncertainty, and they were certain. They were preparing. They were readying their vehicles for departure. They were monitoring the signs. And the signs, Applewhite told them, were everywhere. The world was accelerating toward its recycling. The wars, the plagues, the environmental destruction, the moral decay, all of it was evidence that the program was nearing its end, that the garden was about to be spaded under, that the window for departure was closing. By now, the group had been in existence for over 2 decades. 20 years of isolation and indoctrination, 20 years of escalating sacrifice, 20 years of a closed linguistic and psychological system that had reshaped the minds of its members as thoroughly as any sculptor reshapes clay. The people who remained were not the same people who had walked into that meeting in Waldport, Oregon, all those years ago. They had been remade cell by cell, thought by thought, word by word, until the person they had been was as distant and foreign as a character in a book they had read once and half forgotten. They were ready. They simply did not yet know what they were ready for. And then, in the autumn of 1996, the group moved into a large Spanish-style mansion in a gated community in Rancho Santa Fe, California, just north of San Diego. It was a beautiful property, 9,000 square feet, nestled among the eucalyptus trees and the manicured lawns of one of the wealthiest communities in the United States. They rented it for $10,000 a month, paid from the proceeds of their web design business. The neighbors noticed them, quiet, polite, identically dressed, always in groups, never quite meeting your eyes. A little odd perhaps, but harmless. Certainly harmless. And somewhere out beyond the orbit of Jupiter, still invisible to the naked eye but already detected by astronomers, already tracked and catalogued and named, a comet was falling toward the sun. It had been falling for thousands of years, since before the pyramids, since before writing, since before agriculture, since before the last ice age retreated, and the first human settlements rose from the mud of river valleys on the other side of the world. It was a ball of ice and rock and dust, ancient beyond comprehension, indifferent beyond measure, and it was called Hail Bop, and it was coming, and soon everyone on Earth would be able to see it hanging in the sky like a lantern, like a signal, like an invitation. And Marshall Applewhite, alone in his room in that beautiful rented mansion, was already composing the message he would deliver to his followers when the moment came. The message he had been preparing for 20 years, the message that would change everything, the message that would end everything, the last sermon in the last church of the last prophet of a theology, built from loneliness and longing, and the desperate human need to believe that there is something more, something above, something waiting just beyond the visible sky. And so the group waited. Through the long months of 1996, they waited in that rented mansion, on a quiet hillside in Rancho Santa Fe, California, surrounded by landscaped gardens and the soft hum of expensive silence, running their web design business, building websites for clients who had no idea that the polite, efficient people on the other end of the email believed they were extraterrestrial souls temporarily housed in human containers. They waited because Marshall Applewhite had told them that a signal was coming, that Ty, his departed partner, his cosmic other half, the woman who had died of cancer a decade earlier, but who he insisted had merely graduated ahead of them, was preparing their departure from the other side. They waited because waiting was what they had always done. Their entire theology was a theology of anticipation, of readiness, of bags packed and shoes tied and eyes turned upward toward a sky that had not yet delivered its promise. And then, in the autumn of 1996, the sky finally seemed to answer. On the night of November 14th, an amateur astronomer in Houston, Texas, a man named Chuck Schramek, pointed his telescope at the Hale-Bopp comet, which had been growing brighter in the heavens for months, and he captured an image that would, through a strange and winding chain of events, seal the fate of 39 people in a mansion by the sea. What Schramek believed he saw was an anomalous object trailing behind the comet, something large, something with a ring around it, like Saturn, something that to his excited and perhaps insufficiently critical eye looked distinctly artificial. He called in to a late-night radio program called Coast to Coast AM, hosted by Art Bell, a man whose gravelly voice had become the soundtrack of American paranoia, broadcasting nightly to millions of listeners who tuned in from their beds and their trucks and their lonely kitchen tables to hear about UFOs and government conspiracies and things that moved in the darkness between the stars. And on that night, Art Bell gave Chuck Schramek a platform, and Schramek told the world that something was following the comet. The claim spread like a brush fire through the dry grass of the internet, which was still young then, still ungoverned, still a place where a rumour could outrun its own debunking by days or weeks. Astronomers responded almost immediately. The object Schrammick had photographed was a star. It was a well-catalogued star that happened to sit in the background of his image, rendered slightly distorted by the optics of his telescope. There was no companion object. There was no spacecraft. There was nothing following Hale-Bopp but the cold vacuum of space and the faint tails of its own sublimating ice. But by the time the debunking arrived, it did not matter. Not for everyone. Not for the 39 people in the mansion in Rancho Santa Fe. Because Marshall Applewhite had heard the broadcast, or heard about the broadcast, and in that moment, something clicked into place inside his mind with the finality of a lock turning. This was the sign. This was what they had been waiting for. All those years, through all those moves and all those name changes and all those failed predictions and quiet disappointments. T was coming. The next level had sent a craft, and it was hiding in the wake of the comet, concealed from the instruments of a world that was not meant to see it, visible only to those who had the spiritual eyes to perceive what was really there. The spacecraft was approaching, riding the comet's trail like a great celestial chariot, and it was coming for them. It was coming to take them home. And now, breathe slowly. Let your body settle deeper into wherever you are resting. Let the weight of your limbs grow heavy and warm. Because what comes next in this story unfolds with a strange and terrible calm, a calm that is perhaps the most disturbing element of the entire Heaven's Gate narrative, more disturbing than the ideology, more disturbing than the act itself. What comes next is the spectacle of 39 human beings preparing for their own deaths, with the quiet, methodical cheerfulness of people packing for a long-awaited vacation. In the weeks that followed, in the early months of 1997, as the Hale-Bopp comet grew brighter and brighter in the evening sky, becoming visible to the naked eye, becoming one of the most spectacular comets of the 20th century, the members of Heaven's Gate began to record their farewell messages. One by one, they sat before a camera in the mansion and spoke. They spoke to the world. They spoke to their families. They spoke to the future. And these tapes, these farewell videos, have become some of the most chilling documents in the history of American cults, not because of what you might expect, not because of tears or terror or the hollow-eyed desperation of people being coerced into something against their will, but because of the exact opposite. Because the people on those tapes are calm. They are articulate. They are by every visible measure at peace. Some of them are smiling. Not the rigid, performed smiles of people under duress, but genuine, warm, almost radiant smiles. The kind of smiles you see on the faces of people who have just received wonderful news, who have just learned that everything they hoped for is about to come true. They sit before the camera in their dark clothing, their hair neatly trimmed, their eyes clear and focused, and they explain, in measured and thoughtful language, that they are about to do the most exciting thing they have ever done. They are about to graduate. They are about to leave their vehicles behind and ascend to the next level. They are about to go home. One after another they speak with the serene confidence of people who have thought deeply about their decision and arrived at a conclusion that fills them with joy. Some of them address their families directly. They say the things you might say before any long journey, the reassurances and the expressions of love, but woven through with the particular vocabulary of Heaven's Gate theology. They tell their parents and siblings and children not to be sad. They acknowledge, with a kind of gentle preemptive forgiveness, that the world will not understand, that the media will call them crazy, that their families will grieve and be confused and perhaps angry, but they want their loved ones to know that this is not a tragedy. This is not a loss. This is, they insist, the greatest moment of their existence. Some of them apologize, not for what they are about to do, but for the pain they know it will cause in a world that cannot see what they see. They are sorry that their families lack the context to understand. They are sorry that the truth they have found will look, from the outside, like madness. But they cannot let the limitations of others prevent them from seizing this extraordinary opportunity. The spacecraft is coming. T is waiting, and they will not miss this bus. Imagine watching these tapes. Imagine pressing play and expecting to see fear, expecting to see doubt, expecting to see some crack in the surface through which the horror of the situation leaks through, and instead finding only this. Only calm, only certainty, only people who look like your neighbour, your co-worker, your aunt, your college roommate, speaking about their impending death as though they were describing a promotion at work or the closing on a new house. This is the thing about Heaven's Gate that separates it from so many other cult tragedies, the thing that makes it linger in the mind long after the details have faded. There were no guns, there were no guards, there was no Jim Jones pacing with a microphone screaming at his followers that the enemy was coming, that there was no other way, that anyone who tried to flee would be shot. There was none of that. There was only this profound, absolute, terrifying belief, and if you are still listening, if you are drifting now in that soft space between waking and sleep, consider for a moment what that means. Consider what it tells us about the architecture of the human mind, about how completely a person's reality can be rebuilt from the inside, brick by brick, assumption by assumption, until the world they inhabit bears no resemblance to the one the rest of us share, and yet feels, to them, more real, more vivid, more true than anything they have ever known. Because that is what had happened to these people. Over years, sometimes over decades, their understanding of reality had been slowly, carefully, almost lovingly dismantled and replaced. Their identities had been dissolved. Their names had been changed. Their connections to family and friends had been severed or attenuated. Their sexual impulses had been suppressed, their individual desires redirected toward the collective purpose. Some of the men had even been castrated voluntarily as a way of shedding the attachments of the flesh. Everything that made them individuals, everything that anchored them to the ordinary human world, had been systematically removed and replaced with the group, with the theology, with the mission. And so when Marshall Applewhite told them that the moment had come, that the comet was the sign and the spacecraft was waiting, they did not experience this as a command to die. They experienced it as an invitation to live, to truly live for the first time in the way they were always meant to, and they prepared accordingly. There is a particular kind of energy that fills a group of people who believe they are on the verge of something transcendent. You can feel it in the farewell tapes, beneath the calm, beneath the measured words and the gentle smiles. It is not mania. It is not hysteria. It is something quieter and more unsettling than either of those things. It is the focused, luminous certainty of people who have stepped beyond fear, beyond doubt, beyond the gravitational pull of ordinary human anxiety, and arrived at a place of pure, distilled purpose. They knew what they were going to do. They knew how they were going to do it. And they believed, with the totality of their beings, that what waited on the other side was not darkness but light, not oblivion but reunion, not the end of consciousness, but its expansion into something vast and shimmering and finally at last free of the heavy, clumsy limitations of the human body. The preparations were meticulous. They were organized with the same careful, detail-oriented efficiency that had made the higher source web design business a modest success. Every element was planned, every item was selected with intention. In the final days, the members of Heaven's Gate packed identical overnight bags. Think about that phrase for a moment. Overnight bags. As though they were going on a trip and would need their things when they arrived. Each bag contained a change of clothing neatly folded, lip balm, a spiral notebook, perhaps for recording observations or thoughts upon arrival at the next level, and money. Each member carried a $5 bill and 3/4 in their pockets, $5.75. The exact reason for this has never been definitively explained. Some have speculated it was intended as a kind of interplanetary toll, a fee for passage, an echo of the ancient Greek tradition of placing coins on the eyes of the dead to pay Charon, the ferryman of the underworld, for passage across the river Styx. Others have suggested it was simply meant as identification, a way of marking themselves as members of the group. Whatever the reason, every single member carried the same amount, $5, 3/4, tucked into the pockets of identical black shirts and identical black pants, and on their feet, they all wore the same shoes, black Nike Decades, a simple, unremarkable athletic sneaker that would, after the events of March 1997, become one of the most unsettling symbols in American cultural memory. Nike would eventually discontinue the model. The shoes became artifacts, relics of something that no brand wants to be associated with. But in those final days, the members of Heaven's Gate laced them up with care, these matching shoes for their matching journey. And if you had walked into that mansion and seen them all dressed alike, you might have thought they were a sports team, or a company on a corporate retreat, or a choir preparing for a performance. On each of their sleeves they wore triangular arm patches, The patches read, in embroidered letters, Heaven's Gate Away Team. It was a Star Trek reference. In the television series, the away team is the group of crew members who beam down from the starship to the surface of a planet to conduct a mission, and then, when the mission is complete, they beam back up to the ship. They return home. That is what the patches meant. We are the away team. We were sent here on a mission. The mission is complete, and now we are returning to the ship. Every detail was a symbol. Every object was a sacrament. The bags, the money, the shoes, the patches, the matching clothing. This was not chaos. This was not frenzy. This was ritual, as carefully choreographed as any religious ceremony in any cathedral or temple on Earth, and it was carried out with a solemnity and precision that would have been beautiful if it were not leading where it was leading. And now let the story slow. Let it move at the pace of breath. Because the ending of Heaven's Gate did not happen all at once. It was not a single moment of collective action, not a mass event triggered by a signal or a countdown. It unfolded over 3 days, in 3 carefully organised waves, and the way it was structured reveals something profound and deeply unsettling about the degree of planning and commitment that went into this final act. The first wave began on March 22nd, 1997, a Saturday. In the mansion on a quiet street in Rancho Santa Fe, a group of members, roughly a third of the total, gathered together. They had prepared a mixture, applesauce or pudding, sweet and soft and easy to swallow, laced with phenobarbital, a powerful barbiturate sedative. They ate the mixture. They washed it down with vodka, which would accelerate the absorption of the drug into their bloodstreams and deepen its sedative effects. And then, as the phenobarbital began to pull them under, as their breathing slowed and their muscles relaxed and consciousness began to recede, like a tide going out, they placed plastic bags over their heads. The bags would ensure that even if the drug alone was not sufficient, the result would be certain. They lay down. They arranged themselves neatly on their bunks and mattresses, on their backs, their arms at their sides, their packed overnight bags placed carefully beside them, ready for the journey. And then the remaining members, the ones whose turn had not yet come, entered the room. They removed the plastic bags, they straightened the bodies, they folded the hands, and they placed purple cloths, purple shrouds, over the faces of the dead. Purple, the colour of royalty, the colour of the divine, the colour of something sacred and set apart. They draped these cloths with care, with tenderness, with the quiet reverence of people performing a holy rite, and then they cleaned up. They washed the dishes, they put things in order, they prepared the next batch of applesauce, and the next day, March 23rd, the second wave took their turn. The same procedure, the same mixture, the same vodka, the same plastic bags, the same gentle laying out of bodies, the same purple shrouds, the same careful cleaning and preparation by those who remained. 2/3 of the group was now gone, lying in neat rows in the rooms of the mansion, their bags beside them, their faces covered, their matching sneakers pointing toward the ceiling. And the members who had performed this last service for their companions, who had cleaned and arranged and covered and tidied, knew that their own turn was next. On March 24th, the third and final wave. The last members of Heaven's Gate. They mixed the applesauce, they poured the vodka, they swallowed the phenobarbital, they placed the bags over their heads, and they lay down beside their friends, their family, the people with whom they had shared years or decades of their lives, the people with whom they had crisscrossed the country in vans and camped in tents and built websites and watched Star Trek and waited for a sign from the sky. They lay down and they closed their eyes and they went wherever it is that consciousness goes when the body stops. But here is the detail that catches in the throat, the small and terrible fact that you carry with you long after the rest of the story has settled into the sediment of memory. The last 2 members to die had no one to clean up after them. There was no one left to remove the plastic bags, no one to straighten their bodies, no one to smooth the purple shrouds over their faces, no one to place their overnight bags neatly by their sides. The last 2 members of Heaven's Gate died alone, in the truest sense, with no one to tend to them as they had tended to others, and their bodies were found as they fell, unattended, a final asymmetry in a plan that had been otherwise perfectly symmetrical. 39 people, 39 sets of hands that had folded clothing and packed bags and laced identical shoes, 39 minds that had looked at the Hale-Bopp comet in the sky and seen not a ball of ice and rock, but a cosmic vessel sent to carry them home, 39 hearts that had beaten their last beats in the quiet rooms of a rented mansion, surrounded by the people they loved most in the world, wearing their away team patches and their matching sneakers, their spiral notebooks and their $5 bills tucked neatly into their pockets. And now the mansion was silent. 39 bodies lay in the rooms of that rented house, on a quiet street in one of the wealthiest communities in America. 21 women, 18 men. The youngest was 26, the oldest was 72. They had been teachers, musicians, computer programmers, artists, mothers, fathers, students. They had lived full and complicated lives before they found this group, before they met this man, before they began the long process of replacing the world with something else. And for 2 days, no one knew. The mansion sat in the California sunshine, its windows closed, its doors locked, its landscaped gardens serene and undisturbed. Neighbours drove past, mail was delivered. The world continued its ordinary business, unaware of what lay behind those walls. Then, on March 26th, a Wednesday, a FedEx package arrived at the home of a man named Rio D'Angelo. Rio was a former member of Heaven's Gate. He had left the group just weeks earlier, but not because he had lost faith. He had left because Applewhite had asked him to leave. He had been given a specific task, a purpose, a role to play in the final chapter of the story. He was to be the group's messenger, the one who would tell the world what had happened and why, the one who would ensure that the departure of Heaven's Gate was understood on its own terms, not filtered through the distortions of a media that could never comprehend what the group had truly been. The FedEx package contained 2 videotapes, the farewell messages, and a letter. The letter explained, in the calm and measured prose that characterized all of Heaven's Gate's communications, that the group had exited their vehicles and boarded the spacecraft trailing the Hale-Bopp comet. They were gone. The mission was complete. Rio read the letter. He watched the tapes. And try to imagine that moment, if you can. Try to imagine being a person who had lived inside that world, who had shared those beliefs, who had eaten meals with those people and studied alongside them and called them by their chosen names, and then watching their faces appear on a television screen, one after another, smiling, saying goodbye, explaining that they were about to do the thing that you yourself had been preparing to do before you were asked to step aside and serve a different function. Try to imagine the collision of emotions in that moment, the grief and the envy and the confusion and the duty all tangled together in the chest of a man standing alone in a room with a VHS tape playing on the screen. And then he did what anyone would do, or perhaps what only someone who had spent years inside this particular reality and was now standing with one foot in it and one foot outside could do. He called his employer, a Beverly Hills estate manager named Nick Matzorkis, and he told him what had happened, and together they drove to Rancho Santa Fe. They arrived at the mansion, they opened the door, and the smell hit them first. That is always the detail that the people who find these things remember, not the sight, not the silence, but the smell. The unmistakable, biological reality of death, cutting through every abstraction, every theology, every carefully constructed narrative about vehicles and next levels and spacecraft. The bodies had been there for days. The Southern California warmth had done its work. They walked through the rooms and they saw them. Row after row, body after body, neatly arranged, identically dressed, purple shrouds over their faces, overnight bags at their sides. 39 people who had believed with absolute and unshakable conviction that this was not death but departure, that this was not an end but a beginning, that the bodies lying on those beds and cots were empty containers, discarded husks, and that the beings who had inhabited them were now somewhere else entirely, somewhere better, somewhere beyond the reach of human suffering and human limitation, aboard a spacecraft that the rest of us could not see. Rio D'Angelo, the messenger, the one who had been chosen to survive, stood in that house of the dead and understood that his mission had begun. The people he had lived with, studied with, believed with, were gone. They had boarded the craft, or they had ceased to exist, and either way, the world needed to know what had happened here and why. Matzorkis called 911. His voice on the recording is strained, careful, the voice of a man trying to communicate something that resists the ordinary language of emergency. "There are bodies," he said. "Many bodies." The San Diego County Sheriff's Department arrived. Deputies walked through the mansion room by room, counting the dead, documenting the scene, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. Some of them had been in law enforcement for decades and had never encountered anything like this. The sheer orderliness of it. The eerie uniformity, the packed bags and the matching shoes and the purple shrouds arranged with such obvious care. This was not a crime scene in any conventional sense. There was no perpetrator to pursue, no victim to save, no motive to unravel. There were only 39 people who had done exactly what they intended to do, in exactly the way they intended to do it, and the evidence of their intention was everywhere, in the farewell tapes and the letters and the meticulous preparations that spoke not of panic or coercion, but of profound, considered and deeply unsettling resolve. And then the world found out. The discovery of the Heaven's Gate bodies became, almost instantaneously, one of the biggest news stories on the planet. Helicopters circled the mansion. Camera crews lined the streets. Reporters stood in front of the house and spoke into microphones with the carefully modulated gravity that television news reserves for events that exceed the normal parameters of human behavior. The images were everywhere. The matching sneakers, the purple shrouds, the neat, almost geometric arrangement of the bodies, the arm patches, the overnight bags. The details were so specific, so strange, so meticulously organized that they bypassed the usual filters of comprehension and lodged directly in the collective imagination. This was not like other tragedies. This was not a fire or a flood or a shooting, something that could be understood through the familiar grammar of catastrophe. This was something else. This was 39 people who had calmly, deliberately, and by every available evidence willingly ended their own lives because they believed a spaceship was hiding behind a comet. And the world did not know what to do with that. Late-night comedians made jokes. They made jokes about the sneakers and the applesauce and the Star Trek patches, because humour is what humans reach for when something is too strange and too disturbing to process through any other channel. Newspaper editorialists wrote sombre columns about the dangers of cults and the vulnerability of the human mind. Psychologists appeared on television and tried to explain, in the language of their discipline, how this could have happened, how intelligent, educated, apparently functional adults could arrive at a place where voluntary death seemed not merely acceptable, but desirable. Theologians weighed in. Sociologists weighed in. Everyone had a theory, a framework, an explanation. And yet something about Heaven's Gate resisted explanation. Something about it remained stubbornly, irreducibly strange, because the easy explanations did not quite fit. This was not Jonestown. At Jonestown in 1978, more than 900 people had died, but the circumstances were fundamentally different. Jim Jones had created a totalitarian state in the jungle of Guyana. There were armed guards. There were people who tried to flee and were dragged back. The final act was carried out under coercion, with armed men standing over crying children and reluctant adults, squirting cyanide-laced punch into the mouths of people who did not want to die. Jonestown was a massacre disguised as a mass suicide. Heaven's Gate was something else. There were no guns in the Rancho Santa Fe mansion. There were no guards. The doors were not locked from the outside. No one was prevented from leaving. In fact, several members had left the group in the weeks and months before the end, and they had been allowed to go without incident. The people who remained, the 39 who swallowed the phenobarbital and pulled the plastic bags over their heads, did so because they wanted to, because they believed. And that is the part that is hardest to sit with. That is the part that keeps researchers and psychologists and ordinary people awake at night, turning the story over and over in their minds, trying to find the seam, trying to find the place where the coercion was hidden, where the force was applied, because surely, no one would do this freely. But the evidence suggests that they did. And this is where the psychology of Heaven's Gate becomes not just a case study in cult dynamics, but a mirror held up to the human condition itself. Because what happened in that mansion was not the result of insanity, not in any clinical sense. The members of Heaven's Gate were not psychotic. They were not experiencing hallucinations or delusions in the way that a psychiatrist would define those terms. They were operating rationally, logically, methodically, within a framework of assumptions that happened to be completely disconnected from consensus reality. And that distinction matters. It matters enormously, because it means that the barrier between their world and ours is not as thick as we might like to believe. The human mind is a meaning-making machine. It takes the raw data of sensory experience and it weaves it into narratives, into stories, into frameworks of understanding that allow us to navigate the world and make decisions. And most of the time, those frameworks align reasonably well with the frameworks of the people around us, because we are socialized into shared assumptions, shared definitions, shared ways of parsing the chaos of existence into something comprehensible. But the machinery that builds those frameworks is not inherently calibrated to truth. It is calibrated to coherence. The mind does not ask, is this real? It asks, does this fit? And if you are immersed, for years, in an environment where a particular set of assumptions is constantly reinforced, where every question is answered, and every doubt is addressed, and every alternative perspective is gently, systematically excluded, then the framework you're operating within can drift very, very far from the one shared by the rest of humanity, and it will still feel solid beneath your feet. It will still feel like the ground. This is what happened to the members of Heaven's Gate. Their reality had been rebuilt. Not through force, not through violence, not through the crude instruments of physical coercion, but through the slow, patient, almost imperceptible process of social and psychological restructuring that Applewhite and Nettles had refined over 2 decades. And within that rebuilt reality, the act of swallowing phenobarbital and tying a plastic bag over your head was not suicide. It was graduation. It was not the destruction of the self, but the liberation of the self. It was not death, but departure. And if you truly, deeply, with every fibre of your reconstructed being, believed that a spacecraft was waiting to carry you to an existence beyond human comprehension, then the choice to board that spacecraft was not irrational. It was the most rational thing you could possibly do. The horror of Heaven's Gate is not that its members were crazy. The horror is that they were sane. They were sane people operating within an insane premise, and the machinery of their sanity, the logic and reason and careful planning that characterizes rational thought, was applied with full force to the execution of that premise. The meticulous packing of the bags, the organized waves of departure, the careful tending of the dead, the purple shrouds and the matching shoes and the arm patches and the farewell videos, all of it was the product of minds working exactly as minds are supposed to work. The gears were turning perfectly. It was only the foundation that was wrong, and that is the thought that lingers as you drift toward sleep. Not the spectacle of the thing, not the strangeness of the sneakers or the eeriness of the farewell tapes, but the quiet, uncomfortable recognition that the distance between their certainty and ours is measured not in kind but in degree, that the same cognitive architecture that allowed them to believe in a spacecraft behind a comet allows us to believe in the 1,000 unexamined assumptions that structure our own lives, that the mind's hunger for meaning, for narrative, for a story that makes sense of the chaos is the same hunger whether it leads to a laboratory or a cathedral or a mansion in Rancho Santa Fe. In the days after the discovery, the Heaven's Gate website remained online. It stayed live for years, in fact, maintained by surviving members who had not been in the mansion, who had left the group at various points but who still believed, who still tended the digital monument to their departed friends like groundskeepers maintaining a cemetery. The website is still accessible today, preserved in its original 1990s design, a relic of early internet aesthetics with its starry backgrounds and simple HTML. A ghost ship drifting through the modern web, still carrying its message to anyone who stumbles across it. The purple shrouds were lifted, the bodies were identified, the families were notified. 21 women, 18 men, ages 26 to 72, from all walks of life, from all parts of the country, united in death as they had been united in belief, lying in their matching clothes and their matching shoes with their packed bags beside them, ready for a journey that the rest of the world could not see. And the Hale-Bopp comet continued on its path across the sky, brilliant and indifferent, trailing nothing behind it but dust and ice and the ancient light of the sun reflected off its slowly evaporating surface, arcing through the solar system on an orbit that would not bring it back to Earth's skies for another 2,500 years. By then, this story will be ancient history. By then, the mansion and the sneakers and the purple shrouds will be as distant as the pharaohs and their tombs. But somewhere, in whatever quiet corner of the universe consciousness retreats to when the body is done, 39 people who believed they were boarding a spacecraft are either exactly where they expected to be, or they are nowhere at all. And we, the living, the ones still wearing our vehicles, still walking in our own Nike sneakers or bare feet across the ordinary ground of an ordinary world, we are left to wonder which it is. But not tonight. Tonight, let the wondering go. Let the story settle like dust on a still surface. Let your breathing slow and your thoughts soften, and the weight of 39 packed overnight bags and 39 pairs of matching shoes dissolve into the quiet darkness behind your eyes. The comet has passed, the mansion is empty, and you are here, safe, warm, drifting, carried not by a spacecraft but by the simple, ancient vessel of sleep, moving toward whatever dreams are waiting on the other side of consciousness. Let them come, let everything else go. The story is told, the night is yours. In the days that followed the discovery, the world wanted to know who they were. Not their celestial names, not the identities they had chosen within the group, but who they had been before. And as the names began to surface, as the families came forward and the histories were pieced together, a portrait emerged that was deeply uncomfortable for a public that wanted to dismiss the dead as lunatics, as people fundamentally different from themselves. Because the 39 were not who anyone expected them to be. They were not uneducated. They were not broken in the ways we like to imagine broken people look. They were, by nearly every conventional measure, ordinary Americans who had lived ordinary lives before finding their way to that mansion in Rancho Santa Fe. And this ordinariness was the detail that unsettled people most, because ordinariness is a mirror, and no one wanted to see their own reflection in the faces of the dead. Among them was Thomas Nichols, the brother of Nichelle Nichols, the actress who had portrayed Lieutenant Uhura on Star Trek, a show about exploring the cosmos, about seeking out new life and new civilizations. The cruel symmetry of this was not lost on anyone. Thomas had been a devoted member of the group for years. His sister, who had inspired generations to look to the stars with wonder and curiosity, now grieved a brother who had looked to those same stars and seen something else entirely, something that called him away from this world forever. There was a former car dealer among them, a man who had spent years on lots under bright flags and bunting, negotiating prices, shaking hands, living a life so thoroughly American it could have been a Norman Rockwell painting. There were computer programmers, skilled professionals who understood the architecture of digital systems, who could build elegant solutions to complex problems, who thought in logic and structure, and yet had found their way to a belief system that, from the outside, seemed to defy all logic entirely. There were musicians, people who had felt the transcendence that comes from creating beauty, from losing yourself in melody and harmony, and who had perhaps recognized in that transcendence a whisper of something larger, something they spent the rest of their lives trying to hear more clearly. There was a mail carrier, someone who had walked the same routes day after day, who knew the rhythms of neighborhoods, who had delivered letters and packages and small pieces of other people's lives to their doors. There were people with families who loved them, parents who remembered them as children, siblings who had shared holidays and arguments, and the ordinary intimacies of growing up together, friends who had lost touch, and now learned, in the worst possible way, where the silence had led. The media narrative settled quickly into a comfortable framework. They were crazy, they were delusional, they were weak-minded people who had been preyed upon by a madman. This narrative served a very specific psychological function, and it is worth pausing here to understand what that function was, because it reveals something important not about the dead but about the living. When we call cult members crazy, when we dismiss them as fundamentally different from ourselves, we are performing an act of psychological self-defense. We are drawing a line between us and them, a line that says this could never happen to me. I am too rational, too grounded, too aware. This line is a fiction. It is a comfortable fiction, perhaps a necessary fiction for daily functioning, but it is a fiction nonetheless. And the evidence, accumulated over decades of research into cult recruitment, group psychology, and the mechanisms of belief, says something very different from what that fiction would have us believe. The evidence says that vulnerability to cult recruitment is not a function of stupidity or mental illness or some fundamental defect of character. It is a function of being human. It is a function of having needs that are not being met, of standing at a crossroads where the old maps no longer seem to lead anywhere meaningful, of possessing the very qualities we most admire in people, qualities like intelligence, idealism, openness, and the courage to seek answers beyond the conventional. The psychologist Margaret Singer, who spent her career studying coercive persuasion and the mechanisms by which groups capture and hold the minds of their members, identified 6 conditions necessary for what she called thought reform. These conditions do not require exotic circumstances. They do not require secret laboratories or science fiction technologies. They require only the careful, patient construction of an environment in which a person's sense of reality is gradually replaced by the group's sense of reality, in which the individual's identity is slowly dissolved and reformed in the image the group requires. The first condition is gaining control over a person's time and physical environment, not through chains or locked doors necessarily, but through the creation of a schedule so full, a life so structured, that there is simply no time left for outside reflection, no space in which doubt might take root and grow. The second is creating a sense of powerlessness, coercion, and anxiety. This can be as subtle as the social pressure of a group that watches and evaluates its members constantly, where the fear of disapproval or exclusion keeps everyone performing their belief with convincing sincerity. The third is manipulating rewards and punishments to suppress former social behavior. The things that once brought pleasure, the relationships that once provided comfort, are systematically devalued and replaced with the group's own system of approval and disapproval. The fourth is manipulating rewards and punishments to acquire the group's desired behavior. New habits, new language, new ways of thinking are reinforced through acceptance and praise, while deviations are met with concern, correction, or the withdrawal of the group's warmth. The fifth is creating a closed system of logic that does not permit questioning. Within this system, every doubt has an answer, every objection has a rebuttal, and the act of questioning itself is reframed as a symptom of the very problem the group claims to cure. The sixth condition is keeping the recruit unaware that there is an agenda to control or change them. The most effective thought reform does not announce itself. It feels, to the person experiencing it, like discovery, like awakening, like finally finding the truth they had been searching for all along. These 6 conditions were present in Heaven's Gate, not as sudden impositions but as gradual accretions, layers added so slowly that no single layer felt heavy enough to resist. And the people most likely to encounter these conditions, the people most likely to find themselves in environments where these conditions could take hold, were not the people we might expect. Research into cult vulnerability has identified several factors that increase a person's susceptibility to recruitment, and these factors read less like a catalogue of weakness than like a description of the human condition at its most open and searching. Life transitions are among the most significant vulnerability factors. Moving to a new city, starting a new job, ending a relationship, graduating from school and facing the vast, unstructured future for the first time, retirement and the sudden absence of purpose that had been provided by decades of work. These transitions create gaps in a person's social support network and sense of identity, gaps that a well-organized group can fill with remarkable efficiency. Recent loss is another factor. The death of a parent, the end of a marriage, the loss of a career that had provided not just income but meaning. Grief opens a door that is difficult to close, and for some, the group waiting on the other side of that door offers something grief cannot find anywhere else. A framework in which the loss makes sense, in which the pain serves a purpose, in which the future holds something bright enough to make the present bearable. The desire for meaning is perhaps the most universal vulnerability of all. Most people, at some point in their lives, feel the ache of purposelessness, the nagging sense that there must be more to existence than the daily routine of work and consumption and sleep. This ache is not a symptom of dysfunction. It is, arguably, one of the most human feelings there is, and it is precisely this ache that groups like Heaven's Gate are designed to soothe, offering a cosmic narrative in which every individual has a role, every action has significance, and life itself is part of a grand, unfolding plan that extends far beyond the boundaries of ordinary perception. High intelligence, counterintuitively, is also a vulnerability factor, and this deserves careful attention because it contradicts one of our most cherished assumptions about the relationship between intelligence and belief. We assume that smart people are harder to fool. We assume that education is a vaccine against manipulation, but the research suggests something more complicated and more troubling. Idealism is a vulnerability, that burning desire to make the world better, to live according to principles rather than convenience, to sacrifice comfort for truth. Idealists are drawn to groups that promise transformation, that speak in the language of higher purpose, that frame their activities as part of a great and noble mission. An openness to experience, that personality trait associated with creativity, curiosity, and the willingness to explore unfamiliar ideas, is also a vulnerability, because openness means precisely what it says: a door that is open, a mind that does not slam shut at the first sign of the unconventional. The recruitment process used by groups like Heaven's Gate relies on a principle that social psychologists call the foot in the door technique. The idea is simple and devastatingly effective. You do not begin by asking for everything. You begin by asking for almost nothing. You invite someone to a meeting, just one meeting, no commitment, no pressure. At the meeting, you are warm and welcoming. You listen. You make the person feel seen and understood. You offer ideas that are interesting, perhaps slightly unconventional, but not alarming. You ask for nothing more than their attention. And then, having established this small beachhead of engagement, you ask for a little more. Another meeting, a weekend retreat, a book to read, a practice to try. Each request is only slightly more than the last. Each step is only marginally beyond the previous commitment, and at no point does the person feel that they are making a dramatic leap, because they are not. They are walking a path of incremental escalation, each step reasonable in the context of the step before it, each new belief a natural extension of the belief already held. This is the boiling frog metaphor made real, and it is worth sitting with the full implications of that metaphor for a moment. If someone had approached any of the 39 on the first day and said clearly and plainly that in 20 years you would consume a lethal mixture of phenobarbital and vodka, lie down on your bunk with a purple shroud over your face, and die believing that your consciousness was about to board a spacecraft hidden behind a comet, every single one of them would have turned and walked away. Every single one. The endpoint was unthinkable at the beginning, but the endpoint was never presented at the beginning. What was presented was a series of small, reasonable steps, each one building on the last, each one moving the boundary of the acceptable just slightly further than it had been the day before. After a year, you believe things you would not have believed on day one. After 5 years, you believe things you would not have believed after 1 year. After 10 years, after 15, after 20. The landscape of the possible has been so thoroughly remapped that what was once unthinkable has become not just thinkable, but inevitable. Not just inevitable, but desirable. Not just desirable, but beautiful. This is the mechanism. This is how ordinary people arrive at extraordinary conclusions, not through a single dramatic conversion, but through the patient, relentless accumulation of small shifts, each one imperceptible in isolation, devastating in aggregate. And this brings us to what may be the most uncomfortable truth about cult vulnerability. The question of why intelligent people are not just susceptible, but in some ways more susceptible than others. The answer lies in the very cognitive tools that intelligence provides. Intelligent people are better at constructing rationalizations. They can build elaborate logical frameworks to support any conclusion, including conclusions that are fundamentally irrational. They enjoy complexity, and a belief system like Heaven's Gate offered extraordinary complexity, layers upon layers of cosmology, theology, and eschatology that rewarded intellectual engagement, that made the believer feel that they were grappling with ideas worthy of their intelligence. Intelligent people tend to trust their own judgment. They have, after all, a lifetime of evidence that their judgment is sound, that their ability to analyze and evaluate has served them well, and so when they evaluate a belief system and find it compelling, they trust that evaluation. The possibility that the evaluation itself has been compromised, that the very tools of analysis have been co-opted by the system they are analyzing, is difficult for an intelligent person to accept, because accepting it means accepting that their most trusted faculty, their mind, has been turned against them. Perhaps most insidiously, intelligent people often believe that they are too smart to be brainwashed. This belief is itself a vulnerability, perhaps the most dangerous vulnerability of all, because it disarms the very defenses it claims to represent. The person who believes they cannot be manipulated has no reason to guard against manipulation. They walk through the world with their shields down, confident in an invulnerability that does not exist, and when they encounter a sophisticated system of persuasion, they mistake the sophistication of the system for evidence of its validity. They think if this were a con, I would see through it, and therefore the fact that I find it convincing means it must be true. But sophistication and truth are not the same thing. A beautifully constructed argument can lead to a false conclusion. An elegant system of thought can be built on foundations of sand, and the more intelligent the believer, the more beautiful and elegant the prison they help to build around their own mind. Heaven's Gate occupied a unique position in the history of high-control groups because it was, in many meaningful ways, the first internet cult. Their website, designed and maintained by the group's own members, many of whom were skilled in the emerging technologies of the mid-1990s, served as a recruitment tool that could reach anyone in the world with a modem and a telephone line. The site laid out the group's beliefs in careful, methodical detail. It presented their cosmology, their theology, their understanding of human evolution and cosmic purpose. It was, by the standards of the early web, well-designed and thorough, a monument to the earnestness with which the members held their beliefs. And there is an irony here so sharp it almost cuts. They used the most advanced technology available to them, the cutting edge of human innovation in communication and information sharing, to recruit people into a belief system that fundamentally rejected the material world and everything in it. They built a digital gateway to a philosophy of physical transcendence. They used the tools of the modern world to invite people to leave the modern world behind entirely. This irony was not merely poetic, it was prophetic. Because what Heaven's Gate pioneered in the 1990s, the use of digital spaces to recruit isolated individuals into extreme belief systems, would become one of the defining phenomena of the 21st century. The pattern they established, finding lonely or searching people in digital spaces, offering them community and meaning, gradually exposing them to increasingly extreme ideas, creating closed information environments that reinforce the group's worldview, while excluding all others. This pattern would be replicated countless times in the decades that followed by groups spanning the full spectrum of ideology and intent. The internet, which promised to connect everyone to everything, also created perfect conditions for the construction of sealed epistemic bubbles, digital rooms where only one version of reality is spoken, where doubt is treated as contamination, where the gradual escalation of belief can proceed without the friction of outside perspective. Heaven's Gate saw this potential before almost anyone else, and they used it with an effectiveness that foreshadowed the radicalization pipelines that would later become the subject of congressional hearings and academic studies and endless anxious commentary. They were ahead of their time in more ways than one. When we place Heaven's Gate alongside the other groups that have come to define the modern understanding of cults, the comparisons illuminate both what was unique about them and what unites all such groups in a single terrible family. Jonestown, where 918 people died in November of 1978 in the jungles of Guyana, was in many ways the opposite of Heaven's Gate. Jim Jones's followers did not go willingly, or at least not all of them did. There were armed guards, there were screams, there were parents who were forced to administer poison to their children before taking it themselves. The deaths at Jonestown were, for many of the victims, acts of coercion carried out under the threat of violence, a mass murder disguised as a mass suicide. Heaven's Gate, by contrast, was characterized by an eerie voluntariness that made it, in some ways, harder to comprehend. There were no guards, there were no weapons. Members who wanted to leave had left over the years, and while the social and psychological costs of leaving were high, the door was never physically locked. The 39 who remained and carried out the exit believed they were doing exactly what they wanted to do. They were calm, they were organized, they recorded farewell videos in which they smiled and expressed excitement about the journey ahead. This voluntariness did not make their deaths less tragic, but it made them more philosophically troubling, because it forced a question that coercion allows us to avoid. What does it mean when a person, freely and without external compulsion, chooses to end their own life in service of a belief? Where is the line between faith and delusion when the believer walks to their death with a smile? Aum Shinrikyo, the Japanese group that released sarin nerve gas in the Tokyo subway in 1995, directed its violence outward, targeting innocent strangers in an act of apocalyptic terrorism. Their leader, Shoko Asahara, built a belief system that justified the murder of non-believers as a form of spiritual liberation, a twisted compassion that freed the victims from the cycle of suffering by killing them. Heaven's Gate's violence, if it can even be called violence, was directed entirely inward. They harmed no one but themselves. They left the world exactly as they found it, minus 39 of its inhabitants. This distinction matters not because it lessens the tragedy, but because it reveals the particular flavour of Heaven's Gate's pathology, a group so thoroughly focused on transcendence that the only destruction they contemplated was the destruction of their own physical forms. The Branch Davidians, who died in the fire at Waco in 1993, existed in a space between these extremes a group that armed itself against a perceived external threat and died in a conflagration whose causes are still debated, some arguing that the fire was set deliberately by the group, others that it was an unintended consequence of the government's assault. The Branch Davidians did not plan their deaths as Heaven's Gate did. They did not prepare methodically over months. Their end came in chaos and fire, and the fog of a standoff that spiraled beyond anyone's control. Heaven's Gate's departure was the opposite of chaotic. It was perhaps the most carefully planned and deliberately executed mass suicide in modern history, carried out with the precision of a military operation and the serenity of a religious sacrament. What unites these groups, despite their profound differences in method and circumstance, is a constellation of shared features that appear again and again wherever high-control groups emerge. A charismatic leader who claims unique access to truth, whether that truth comes from God or aliens or the leader's own prophetic insight. A closed belief system that accounts for everything, that has an answer for every question and a rebuttal for every doubt, that creates a self-referential loop in which the system validates itself, and all contradictory evidence is absorbed and neutralized. Isolation from competing narratives, whether physical isolation in a compound or psychological isolation, achieved through the systematic devaluation of all outside sources of information and relationship. And finally, the gradual normalization of the unthinkable. The slow, patient process by which actions that would be instantly rejected by any newcomer come to seem not just acceptable, but necessary. Not just necessary, but sacred. These shared features suggest that the phenomenon of the destructive cult is not a series of isolated aberrations, but a recurring pattern in human social behavior. A pattern that emerges whenever certain conditions align, when a certain kind of leader meets a certain kind of follower in a certain kind of moment, when the human need for meaning and belonging encounters a system designed to exploit those needs to their ultimate and terrible conclusion. And now we come to what may be the most unsettling detail in the entire story of Heaven's Gate, a detail that is still true today, that is true even as these words settle into the air around you. 2 surviving members of the group still maintain the Heaven's Gate website. They still answer the email address listed on its pages. They still believe. They consider themselves caretakers, stewards of the group's message, awaiting their own departure from this world at a time that has not yet been revealed to them. They tend the digital garden of a belief system whose founders are dead, whose members are dead, whose prophecy by any external measure failed. The comet passed. No spacecraft was revealed. No consciousness was uploaded to any vessel. The bodies were buried or cremated, and the world moved on. But the belief did not die. It survived the death of everyone who held it. It survived the failure of its central prediction. It persists, tended by 2 faithful gardeners in a digital space that loads as easily today as it did in 1997. Its pages preserved like insects in amber, its message unchanged, its invitation still extended to anyone who finds their way to its URL. This persistence is perhaps the most profound testament to the power of belief that the story of Heaven's Gate offers. We like to think that beliefs die when they are disproven, that evidence is the antidote to delusion, that the failure of a prophecy will shatter the faith that produced it. But the research into failed prophecy, going back to Leon Festinger's study of a flying saucer cult in the 1950s, tells a different story. When prophecy fails, believers do not always abandon their beliefs. Sometimes they double down. Sometimes they reinterpret the failure as a test, or a delay, or a misunderstanding of the timeline. Sometimes they find in the failure itself a confirmation of their faith, reasoning that the fact that they still believe despite the evidence is proof of the depth and authenticity of their commitment. The 2 caretakers of the Heaven's Gate website are living embodiments of this phenomenon, and their quiet, persistent faith is more disturbing than any dramatic spectacle of cult behavior could be, because it suggests that belief, once it takes root deeply enough in the human mind, becomes something very close to permanent, something that outlives evidence, outlives the believers themselves, outlives the very world it was designed to explain. The mansion in Rancho Santa Fe is gone now. It was demolished sometime after the events of March 1997. The property was subdivided, and new homes were built on the land where 39 people lay down for the last time. The neighborhood is quiet, affluent, unremarkable. The streets are lined with the same kind of landscaping you find throughout Southern California, bougainvillea and bird of paradise, and the dusty silver green of olive trees. Children ride bicycles on the sidewalks. Sprinklers turn on at dusk and off at dawn. Cars pull into driveways and garage doors close behind them with a soft mechanical hum. There is nothing to mark what happened there. No plaque, no memorial. The land has been folded back into the ordinary fabric of suburban life, and the events that took place upon it have been absorbed into the larger story of the 1990s, filed alongside other strange and terrible things that happened in a decade that now feels very far away. The comet Hale-Bopp reached its closest approach to Earth in April of 1997, and then continued on its long, slow arc through the outer solar system. It will not return for approximately 2,500 years. By the time it reappears in the skies above Earth, everything about the world we know will have changed beyond recognition. The civilizations that exist then, if civilizations still exist, will likely have no memory of the 39 people who believed a spacecraft travelled in the comet's wake. The comet itself will remember nothing. It is ice and rock and dust, and it moves through the vacuum of space without intention or awareness, tracing the same gravitational path it has traced for millions of years, indifferent to the meanings that any living creature on any small blue planet has ever projected onto its cold, bright passage through the night. But tonight, the website still loads. You could visit it now if you chose to. The pages would appear, slightly dated in their design, a relic of the early internet's aesthetic, and you would find there the words of people who believed so completely in their message that they were willing to die for it. Words that have now been floating in the digital ether for nearly 3 decades, waiting patiently for readers who may never come, or who may come and be changed by what they find, because the door is still open, the invitation still stands, and the 2 caretakers still wait, still believe, still tend the garden of a faith that the world has largely forgotten. What does Heaven's Gate teach us in the end about ourselves? Not about them, not about the 39, not about Marshall Applewhite or Bonnie Nettles, but about the species to which we all belong, about the strange and beautiful and terrifying animal that looks up at the stars and cannot help but ask why. It teaches us that the need for meaning is not a luxury. It is not a philosophical indulgence reserved for those with enough leisure to contemplate their own existence. It is a drive as fundamental as hunger or thirst, a need woven into the very architecture of consciousness, and when it is not met through the ordinary channels of life, through work and love and community, and the small daily satisfactions that sustain most people through their years, it will seek satisfaction elsewhere. It will seek it in systems of thought that promise to answer every question, to fill every void, to transform the ache of purposelessness into the ecstasy of cosmic significance. And if the system that offers these answers also demands everything, demands your money, your relationships, your autonomy, your identity, and ultimately your life, the need for meaning can be powerful enough to say yes to all of it, because a life with meaning, even a meaning that leads to death, can feel more bearable than a life without any meaning at all. Heaven's Gate teaches us that belonging is not merely pleasant but necessary, that human beings are social animals whose sense of self is constructed in relationship to others, and that a group which offers total belonging, which says you are one of us, you are understood, you are valued, you have a place in a story larger than yourself, can become so central to a person's identity that leaving the group feels not like liberation, but like annihilation, like the death of the self, which is in its own way a fate more terrifying than physical death itself. The 39 did not fear death because the group had become the ground on which their identities stood, and to leave the group would have been to fall into a void more frightening than any grave. They chose death together over life apart, and while this choice is heartbreaking, it is not, if we are honest, entirely incomprehensible. We have all felt the pull of belonging. We have all experienced the warmth of being part of something larger than ourselves. We have all, in moments of loneliness or disconnection, felt the cold absence of that warmth, and known, in our bones, that we would do almost anything to feel it again. The difference between us and them is not one of kind, but of degree, and the distance between the ordinary human need for connection and the extraordinary lengths to which that need drove the members of Heaven's Gate is shorter than we would like to believe, and Heaven's Gate teaches us about transcendence, about the longing to rise above the limitations of the body, the constraints of time, the finality of death. This longing is not unique to cult members. It is the engine of religion, of art, of science, of every human endeavour that reaches beyond the immediate and the material towards something higher, something lasting, something that will endure after the body has returned to the earth from which it came. The members of Heaven's Gate felt this longing with an intensity that consumed them, and they found in Applewhite's teachings a promise of transcendence so vivid, so detailed, so seemingly within reach, that they were willing to trade everything for it. They were wrong about the spacecraft, they were wrong about the comet, they were wrong about what awaited them on the other side of death. But the longing that drove them was not wrong. It was human. It was, in fact, one of the most human things about them. This refusal to accept that consciousness ends with the cessation of the heartbeat. This insistence that there must be more, that the universe must hold some meaning beyond the blind mechanics of physics and chemistry and the cold indifference of entropy. We do not have to share their conclusions to recognize their longing as our own. And now let the story begin to dissolve, as all stories eventually do, into the silence from which they emerged. Let the facts and the names and the dates and the theories settle like sediment to the bottom of a still pool, leaving the surface clear and calm and reflective. The California night is settling over the hills of Rancho Santa Fe. The sun has gone, leaving behind a sky that transitions from deep gold to rose to violet to the profound, encompassing blue of true darkness. The air is cooling. The scent of jasmine and eucalyptus moves through the streets on a breeze so gentle it barely qualifies as wind. The houses are lit from within, warm yellow rectangles of window light that speak of dinner tables and television screens, and the small, sacred routines of evening, the putting of children to bed, the locking of doors, the quiet conversations that happen between people who have shared enough days together that silence has become a language of its own. The stars are appearing. One by one, they emerge from the deepening blue, faint at first and then brighter, taking their places in the ancient patterns that human beings have been watching and naming and telling stories about, since the first eyes looked upward and the first minds wondered what they were. There is Sirius, the brightest, burning with a fierce blue-white light that has travelled more than 8 years to reach your eyes. There is Betelgeuse in the shoulder of Orion, a red giant nearing the end of its life, a star that may have already exploded in a supernova whose light has not yet reached us. There are the stars of the constellations, Cassiopeia and Cygnus and Lyra and all the others, names given to patterns that exist only from our particular vantage point in the galaxy, patterns that would dissolve into randomness if viewed from any other angle, any other distance, any other world. And somewhere among those stars, or so 39 people believed, there was a destination, a place prepared for them, a level above human that they had earned through decades of discipline and devotion, and the final irreversible act of leaving their containers behind. Whether that destination exists, whether any destination exists beyond the one we can see and measure and prove, is a question that the universe does not answer, and the silence settles, and the breathing slows, and the story is done, and sleep arrives.